Hello everyone, today we're taking a look at an interesting shotgun. Now, when I say interesting, I don't mean interesting insofar as this is a really good shotgun. I mean interesting insofar as the opposite of a really good shotgun. Today's example is, of course, none other than the Walther Automatic Shotgun. Now, already at that term, we're at a fork in the road. This gun has been known by a variety of different names, one of them being Walther Toggle Action. I think this is the least correct name to call it. It seems that most of that comes from people not being aware or wanting to assign a particular name to it. Nothing from the time this gun was made described it as being named Walther Toggle Action Shotgun. So, as a result, I don't think that's the most accurate name. Some few sources call this the Walther M1921. I think this is, again, a sort of people trying to assign a name to it that the guns didn't originally have. The gun's manual calls it the Walther Automatic Shotflint, which is roughly translates to Walther Automatic Shotgun. So for this video, for the purposes of talking about this thing, I will try and stick with calling it the Walther Automatic Shotgun. However, I will try and catch myself when I do this, but I sort of fell in love with this gun because of Call of Duty World War II.
A bomb's been planted on our ammo supply!
Which I am personally ashamed to admit, but of course this gun in that game had like a funny box magazine sticking out the bottom. It was certainly not accurately depicted, but I thought it was just sort of so cool that Walther made a shotgun. In that game, the gun is called the Toggle Action, so inadvertently I sometimes refer to it as the Toggle Action still, but Walther Automatic Shotgun is the most correct way to refer to this. With that housekeeping matter out of the way, what the heck are we dealing with here? Well, we already sort of talked about it. It's got a toggle on the inside. It's actually a somewhat similar toggle to the way that the Luger's toggle works insofar as the members that it has, although that's pretty much the end of the similarity. The way that the toggle works, the actual action itself, the rest of this is not really like a Luger, and the toggle on this gun breaks down instead of breaking up. Frankly, I think this gun would have been much cooler if they put a great big window on top of the receiver and had the toggle break up. That would have looked really cool. Instead, the toggle breaks down on the inside, and even in slow motion, you can't even fully tell that it's a toggle action firearm. So you miss out on the sort of cool style points that you ordinarily get with a toggle, but this is a automatic shotgun. Of course, automatic in the context, this context means self-loading, so it's a semi-automatic shotgun, but advertised and sold as an automatic shotgun because that's how things went at the time. Like, if we remember Browning Auto 5, the auto meant automatic and it was marketed as the Browning Automatic 5, the 5 being 5 shots. It was not full auto, it was semi-auto. Automatic was just used to describe the loading mechanism instead of the firing mechanism. But this is a 2.5-inch roll crimp chambered shotgun. I guess the chamber could use a 2.5-inch star crimp, but the gun will not feed a 2.5-inch star crimp. And unlike with the Hjorgren, which people describe as being 2.5-inch, but which most of them have 2 3/4-inch chambers and run 2 3/4-inch ammo fine, the Walther requires this roll crimp stuff. Of course, I've got double A's that were 2 3/4 that I cut down to hand load to feed this thing. Because finding loads that are suitable for this gun is difficult, that endeavor is expensive, and these guns are, generally speaking, fragile. We'll talk a lot more in a ton of detail about how they're fragile, why they're fragile, what to do about that later in this video. Because I am hoping that this video can be a more or less comprehensive look at the Walther Toggle Action, what's involved with trying to keep one running, because I got this example missing a bunch of parts. It's a total of 4, you're looking at 4 different Walther Toggle Actions here, because along the line, like this gun's 100 years it's existed, people have swapped parts in and out of it from other guns in an effort to keep them working. And it's in this regard that I do want to have another housekeeping note that this shotgun has increased my appreciation for the Hjorgren a lot. In the Hjorgren video, I described it as being like an immature design. It's not very good, it's fragile, it's not very well put together. You know, this thing makes the Hjorgren look refined. When you look at how frequently these things break parts, how few of the parts will interchange from one shotgun to the next, this thing really is hand fit in the bad sort of way, as opposed to hand fit in the good sort of way. Like, we understand Cosmes are hand fit because with hand fitting you can get a level of part interlock that you can't really achieve in mass manufacture. The Walther was hand fit for the other reason, similar to the Rheinmetall NR4 we've looked at previously. And in fact, both of those guns came out of Germany there in the 1920s. The reason they were being hand fit is because Germany was short on raw materials, had an excess of manpower and did not have sufficient numbers of industrial manufacturing machines because one way or another, either as a direct result or as a sort of resultant of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was down on its luck economically, and its manufacturing industrial base lacked the modern amenities that its sort of ex-enemies, soon-to-be enemies again, had. America was burgeoning with machine tools. England and France burgeoning with machine tools. Germany did not have anywhere near enough machine tools, and so a lot of hand-fitting went on in manufacture. Now, they're very similar again to the Rheinmetall NR4. The Walther Automatic was born out of this desire for arms manufacturers who had their hands tied in one regard or another by the Treaty of Versailles to leverage their, what's the comparative advantage in the market? They know how to make guns. Well, the Treaty of Versailles says there's only certain guns they can make, and they can only make so much of a certain gun, and it can't be for these purposes or that purposes. So the thing that sort of many of these companies fall into is sporting arms. You see Germany make a lot of .22 rifles intended for export. You see a lot of pocket pistols intended for export. You see a lot of shotguns intended for export. Most of these German companies are looking at side-by-side shotguns because they're frankly the easiest to make. But a few companies, such as Rheinmetall or Walther here, would there in the early 1920s try and take the leap into making an automatic shotgun. Now, Walther's effort was primarily spearheaded by Fritz Walther. Georg Walther also helped him on this effort, but when you go and look at, the historical record reflects that this was mostly Fritz Walther's brainchild. The surviving records are not extremely clear, but it seems like production began sometime around 1921, and it ran through maybe the late 20s, maybe into the early 30s, but sources disagree about whether the sales in the 30s were just remaining stock of guns or not. This production that started there in the 1920s was originally done by a firm called Deutsche Werk. Walther had sort of outsourced the manufacture of the guns to them. This was largely because Walther, again, was a pocket pistol company. They'd made some side-by-side shotguns, but they didn't really have the facilities or the space to manufacture something as complicated as this. We had already explained Germany was sort of at a lack of machine tools, but there's no getting around the fact that many parts of this gun are going to require machine tools to make. It's going to require big space and big facility in order to pull it off. So at this point in time there in the early 20s, Walther did outsource the manufacture to Deutsche Werk. Now, eventually Walther would bring the manufacture back in, although the records of this are a little fuzzy. It's not clear if Walther brought it into their own factory or Walther bought a new factory to move the manufacture into, or if Walther was just doing final assembly and quality control of parts that were made by Deutsche Werk. It's not exactly clear what happened there. It could have been a combination of some of those things. But what I'd like to really underscore there is that around the time that the manufacture shifted from Deutsche Werk to Walther's name being on the gun as a manufacturer, you see a shift in some of the features the gun has. The most notable of these features that changes is the inclusion of a dust cover here on the ejection port. On the later production guns, you'll have a dust cover here that covers most of the guts that you can see down in here. This was made in response to a criticism that this is a relatively open ejection port and debris or grasses or whatever could get in there, and once it's in there it can cause reliability and cycling problems for the thing. You'll also see throughout the gun's production, it's not just that, okay, once the Walther's name was put on there as a manufacturer, this changed, but one thing that you'll see throughout that entire production run is incremental changes to the design of parts, to the presence or absence of lightning cuts, a lot of tweaks that I think you could best describe as they were trying to chase the durability bugs out of this design. Of course, Germany being there in that interwar period, they were at a lack of good quality steel, so a lot of, for lack of a better term, pot metal steel was being used, where low quality steel was they tried to case harden it to try and get it roughly adequate properties, but their ways to control this was bad, their quality control was bad. And so it seems like Walther was going through a rapid series of iteration throughout the life cycle of this gun to try and improve the design to account for the weakness, the relative low quality of the materials that they were having to deal with. As a result, across the serial range for these guns that you'll find, and especially because these guns are so frequently cannibalized to repair one another, you will see a weird variety of features like different charging handles, different magazine releases. On the inside, you'll see different shapes and sizes on some parts, which really does compound the difficulty of interchanging parts between these guns because they were hand fit, but then they were completely different designs, makes it so that a gun, which by and large relies on cannibalizing other examples to have a one working model, now can't even cannibalize from the whole series. And so it's very common to see these guns in a serious state of disrepair. Like I'd said, I got this one missing parts, and at this point I've got it almost all the way fixed up. I've got new parts made to replace the parts that this gun currently has issues with, but I wanted to show you guys this gun in more or less original condition to give you guys an idea, and maybe in a future video we can talk about fixing them up. But similar to the Hjorgren, I've sort of, against my will, became a Walther Automatic Shotgun gunsmith, where I've made new triggers and sears and noses, I've repaired magazine tubes, I've made new mag releases and action bars. I've made a lot of new parts for these things just to get them to this one example anyway to work. So throughout this video we'll sort of be pointing some of that stuff out, the frequent things that break on them, the things that can be done to fix them. Unfortunately, a lot of the time it's make whole new parts is really the best way to fix it. Now that said, I'm kind of decent at making new parts for this thing at this point, but it's even, again, I want to reiterate, this gun made me appreciate the Hjorgren, and I didn't know that was going to be possible, because I only had to make a couple of parts for the Hjorgren, and they more or less just dropped in, and all of the dimensions on the parts were nominal, right? It was like, this is a 1/4 inch, this is an 1/8 inch, and you go to this thing and it's not like, there's nothing nominal on this gun. So in order to make new parts, you just got to oversize them, and then black them and try to fit them, and black them and try to fit them. And so, fitting a part to this gun takes 10 hours. Fitting a part to the Hjorgren takes, you just make the part to your drawing and you're done. So a lot more difficulty trying to keep these things in operation in that regard anyway. And I guess that's sort of the resolution of the history part of it is, these things are, about 5,000 of them were made by the time in the late 20s, early 30s when production stopped. You will have a harder time finding these, especially in working order compared to the Hjorgren, despite 5,000 of each more or less being made, and the Hjorgren being 20 years older, because the Hjorgrens break less often, and so they're scavenged for parts much less often. It's very uncommon to find one of these where every serial number on the thing in detail all the way taken apart matches. But as I gather from the factory, that is how all the guns left. But even there for warranty work, Walther would swap your parts out with parts from another gun that maybe couldn't be assembled or something, where you will find guns that have a record of, like, the ownership lineage was a guy in Germany bought the gun, Walther worked it over whenever they had some incremental upgrades. The gun got captured during World War II, and one guy has owned it ever since. And the gun will have non-matching numbers. Like, there was no opportunity for this gun to have been scavenged then, and it still won't have matching numbers. And sort of the one thing that you can point to is, well, it was an early serial number gun, but somebody put a dust cover on it at some point. And there is some documentation to suggest that Walther did that work, so some of the mismatching numbers on these guns could maybe even just be explained by Walther would get the guns in for warranty work, or solicited the incremental upgrades to be put on guns to maybe try and repair this gun's reputation, which seems to have been shaky for the whole time it was in production, where its reliability problems and its durability problems were understood at the time, and Walther was trying to damage control that by fixing your gun for you. But that may even help further explain why it's so difficult to find one that is in completely original shape. I've seen one where every single number I checked on every single part completely matched, and would you believe that it didn't work? The gun still didn't work. So that's sort of what you're dealing with these guns is, don't buy one expecting that it'll work. I know I've talked with a couple of people that are, theirs work, theirs are full of missing numbers, and theirs have, they show signs of somebody made it work at some point in time. So it's not to say that these things are incapable of working, it's just to say that you expect that this gun will spend more time apart and being worked on than shot, which, to sort of sum up my thoughts here before we jump into the look and disassembly at the thing, that's what makes a shotgun bad in my mind, is it spends more time being worked on than enjoyed. And if you're me anyway, working on them and enjoying them is sometimes that's not mutually exclusive, but in the case of this Walther, it's pretty much always. I am past my limit with working on this thing because it's not fun to work on, and as we'll see once we disassemble it, it's not fun to take apart. Now, a note on that disassembly. Similar to my Hyogren video, I would like this video to sort of be a standalone, all-in-one, what you need to know about these things. So we will go through disassembling, we'll talk about the loads that I use and all these sorts of things. But I do want to tell you guys in advance, I am not taking apart the sub-assemblies, I'm not fully stripping the trigger group, I am not fully stripping the bolt group. The bolt group, it's sort of traumatic to the bolt group to fully strip in order to take the pieces of the link apart. You're not supposed to be doing that unless a part of the link is broken or something. So in that case, you're replacing parts, so it's already been pretty traumatic. The trigger group is not traumatic to take apart. Insofar as the parts won't get damaged, it is emotionally traumatic because, wow, we'll see once we get there. I think you guys' reaction will mirror that, right? It's just wow. Like, somebody designed this, put it into production, and was they seriously marketed and sold this. And that's my impression for a lot of the things on this gun, but especially the trigger group. It's a bewildering design. To think that somebody looked at that and said, no, that's good. Put that in production. Last thing I'll say before we get into looking at the thing is I'm going to complain about this gun a lot, and I hope I don't come off as too negative, but if I do, it's because the gun deserves it. Okay. With that understood, we're ready to take a dive into the thing. There's sort of two distinctive characteristics about this thing that everybody likes to point to, and I agree they're cool. The first is this charging handle. The charging handle rotates downwards because it's breaking the rear member of the toggle. So yeah, see, the charging handle comes down and it locks the bolt back. That's cool. I can agree, that's cool. The downside to this, though, is the charging handle is one of these frequently broken parts, and that's because this thin strip of steel is held to a central peg. I've seen them break off of the central peg. I've seen the thin strip of steel just break itself. I've seen the knob break off of the thing. And all of this because this thin piece of steel attached to this knob has to bend, right? It's like the charging handle has to be springy in order for it to be able to fit over the spring that retains it. It's a head scratcher of a design, and I'm being generous when I say it's frankly, if I'm being honest, it's a really bad design. So that's what we've got going on there. You can technically lower the bolt slowly by pressing the button on the bottom and letting the charging handle forward, but you should never close the bolt with the charging handle partway open, or it'll break. This one got broke like that, and we'll take a look at that once we're on the inside. But not only can you break the charging handle doing that, you can break the bolt toggle, right? The big chunky pieces of this thing's action, you can break those just by having that down and then slamming the action. So a recurring theme that we'll talk about is fragile. I thought the Hyogren was fragile. This thing taught me that the Hyogren is, in comparison, a very robust design, because there are so many of the pieces of these guns that I've seen broken in ways that just don't make sense, that it's frankly astounding. There's a lot of pieces on these guns that just break, and they don't break in a way that makes sense, but they're broken. Anyway, we've got a button here on the bottom that closes the bolt. Of course, we'll talk more about the manual of arms in the shooting section, but I wanted to talk about the other distinctive feature. This is your magazine release. Magazine release, that's weird on a tube-fed shotgun. Well, it is a tube-fed shotgun, but the mag folds down. It's not an integral component of the gun, right? It can come on and off, which is cool. And you look at this and think, okay, that's the coolest loading system ever. And I would agree, and I would even go so far as to say there's some serious advantages to this sort of a loading system, except that Walther's execution of it is abysmal, and it takes advantage of none of the potential upsides of this sort of a system, and instead this just introduces downsides compared to having a traditional loading gate. Like, you look at this for the first time and you think, man, that's so cool, why don't more shotguns do that? And then you see Walther's execution of it here and you actually get to load one and you're like, I know why more shotguns didn't do that. That all to say, I think it could have been executed better. Mostly all that Walther had to do is make it so that when the magazine's off the gun, it can retain shells on its own. And I think they would have been most of the way to having a good design or a good system here. But it doesn't do that. And so, if you are in a hurry trying to top off reload, and you pop your magazine all the way down and accidentally flip it off the gun, all of the shells loaded in your magazine are coming out. This is embarrassing and it makes you look silly. The way that this sort of mechanism works There's ordinarily a spring in this handguard magazine system, so that whenever you pull the latch, normally this is just supposed to pop itself all the way down, so it would pop itself into the lowered position. This one is missing the spring. I made up a replacement spring and then realized I like it better without the spring, because compared to the guns that do have the spring, frequently you'll pull the magazine catch, and if you're not holding the magazine, it just throws itself off the gun, right? It just goes boop, all the way off the gun and drops all your shells. So not having the spring actually makes this system somewhat better, at least in my opinion, in my handling of this compared to guns that have the spring. I like it better without the spring, so I'm not repairing that aspect of this gun. I'm leaving that spring out of there. But once it's there, we'll see more in the loading segment, right? You can stuff your shells there into the magazine. 4 in the magazine plus 1 in the chamber gets the thing fully loaded. We'll talk in the disassembly section about why specifically this magazine design isn't so good, but I did just want to show you guys that in terms of external features, this shotgun has 2 tricks, right? It's got 2 weird quirks about it. The charging handle, the magazine, much like the Hjorgren's got the 1 trick, right? It's got an exposed bolt, which is very cool. This shotgun's is a 2-trick pony. That's the end of the redeeming things about the shotgun, and everything else about it will make you unhappy. But that all said, looking at external features, we've got a 14¼ inch length of pole standard on these things, which is really long, especially for that era. That's like sized for a 6 foot tall person. So you may look at that and go, wow, they were expecting people to be 6 foot tall back in 1920 in Germany. Yeah, no, they weren't doing that. The reason the stock is so long is because the whole upper on this gun moves backwards about that far. If your face or hand is too far forward, it's going to bite you. This thing actually comes closer to parts of your body than the bolt does on the Hjorgren. As a result, right, the chance of being maimed by your own gun is higher here than with the Hjorgren. It might not seem it, and that's the most concerning part. You could pick up this gun, load it, and be ready to shoot it and go, like the receiver's not going to jump back at me, is it? Well, it is. And there's nothing that really tells you that it's going to do that, which is certainly something that was complained about some at the time, and many people since then who have shot them and not understood how the action works, especially if you've got like a thumb forward grip of any sort, right? You stick your thumb forward here or here, that upper is going to come back and get you, and it comes back fast enough it will draw blood and badly bruise you. I don't know that it would necessarily break a bone, but maybe. I wouldn't rule it out, because it does, it comes back with some violence behind it. So, all that to say, great length of pull. The stock actually fits me pretty well. They did that on accident, because this was made good because this was made bad. But moving on from that, we have a trigger group, pretty standard going on there. We have a crossbolt safety there in front of the trigger group. Walther fans out there will be able to make fun of Beretta for this, right? Because Beretta and Walther were constantly stealing ideas from each other. Well, this is one that Beretta may have actually stole from Walther. It's the toggle safety there in front of the trigger group. It's possible, anyway, that was stolen from here. But generally speaking, it's otherwise Walther stealing from Beretta in a lot of, at least the most notable instances. But look, Walther Chads, it's not so over. Beretta might have sort of copied something from you once, which is cool. Moving on forward there, we have our barrel. There are a very small number of factory ribbed barrels. I have not seen a vented rib. I've only seen factory solid ribs. You can tell a factory solid rib because this part of the barrel here, you've got a valley on the receiver that lines up with a valley on the barrel. That valley won't be there because it's got a rib instead. The guns that don't have a rib, however, have a landing strip up here with a bead, which does lead me to the thing that maybe we'll talk about it more in the shooting segment, but the thing that I really want to drive home for you guys is that, okay, there's a lot that can be said bad about the shotgun, and we'll say it. We'll say it all. I will not try and hold back on saying bad things about this gun. However, it is really lightweight for what it is. 7.25 pounds. It's not bad for an automatic 12 gauge, especially at this point in history. The Hjorgren maybe they're at the same weight range, really, so maybe it's not as impressive, but it's lighter than the Auto 5, which is cool. The length of the stock, which wasn't on purpose, it was driven by other concerns, but it makes it so the gun fits me really well, and it does balance pretty well. It points pretty naturally. It points more naturally than you might expect it to, considering how bad the rest of it is. And so, credit where credit is due, It does shoot well when it works. The when it works part is the complicating factor, because it usually doesn't. We'll get more into that as we dive into the disassembly section here, but I do want you guys to keep that in mind, is that as critical as I'm going to be for the gun, I will be honest, it does shoot pretty good, right? It does shoot pretty well, and I hope to eventually go and shoot a couple of pheasants with it, just to prove that, because this thing's pedigree was predominantly to be a hunting arm, so much like I had done with that Hyogren I'd fixed up, I would like to be able to take this out to a field and shoot some pheasants with it, just to sort of get the authentic, this is what it was designed for at some rate, was shooting live birds. I imagine, I'm calling it now, having shot them both at clay birds and understanding that clay birds translates pretty well to shooting things like pheasants. The Hyogren is a much, much better gun than this. But I will go ahead and validate that through experimentation anyway. All that aside, we're ready to dive into the disassembly section of the video. The one thing I want to preface before we get to that, though, is that whenever we get to the shooting segment, I've technically already filmed most of the shooting segment. I don't think I need to go and reshoot any of that. However, the gun had a magazine repair done to it at least twice before I got the gun. And then I had tried to I had tried to fix their bodge repair as best I could. And that's the state the gun was in for the shooting segment, and it was falling apart. The bodge repair was on the magazine. We'll take a better look at that later as we're taking it apart. But if you notice a slight difference in the way the magazine looks, like the absence of that little brass spacer ring, well, that's because the shooting segment was technically filmed before this. The gun is now repaired in a more permanent way. That repair is holding up great. So if you notice that little bit of discrepancy, this is technically the third time I'm filming the tabletop version of this video, because the gun has constantly been in and out of the state of disrepair, and I wanted to give you guys a most accurate look at what it looks like when you have one that's in working order. Very difficult thing to do with these things because it's constantly wanting to be broken. I've talked with several other people. I've handled like 6 of these things now, right? So I'm speaking from some experience. I've talked to many people who own them. I've only ever talked with one person who's like, oh, hands down, mine's always been trouble-free. It's just been great. And he hadn't shot it very much. Eventually, like, you poke and prod it, like, well, how much have you shot it? A couple hundred rounds. Well, okay. So one in great shape, couple hundred rounds, I can believe that. At this point, I've probably put 400 rounds, 350, 400 rounds through this thing. It's been in and out of reliability like 3 or 4 times. There's been 3 or 4 different times something has broke or gone awry in it during that time frame. So just to get that out of the way for you guys, if you noticed any like slight discrepancies, like the missing that brass ring now and then in the shooting segment, you'll see it. That's what's going on there. Full disclosure, just want to make sure that you guys are aware. And so with that said, we are ready to dive into the disassembly section of the gun. As we're doing so, I'll try and point out the parts that are frequently broken or missing or needing fitting or replacement on this gun, and sort of talk about how I've been able to fix it, because as far as I'm aware, this gun has most of the common problems that these guns ever have. Those being the trigger issue, charging handle issue, magazine issue, just straight up missing parts issue, a cracked stock. It's been a litany of problems that I've had to address with this gun, but sort of the upside there is I'm hoping to, again, make this an all-in-one video, which is why I'm trying to explain so much so that it's clear. I would like this video to hopefully stand as a little bit of an informative thing, so that if somebody ever gets a wrecked Walther Automatic and wants to fix it, this video will be maximally useful for them, all the information compacted into one place. So for those of you that are just viewing to see the weird, goofy gun, there's probably sections of this video that are like not that relevant to you. So similar to the Hyogren video, I apologize. There's going to be long-winded, rambling sections about fixing guns and repairing guns that might not be as interesting for those of you that are just interested in the mechanisms or the shooting. So if the mechanism and shootings are your thing, you can just skip to the shooting segment and then maybe put this on as background noise at some point. But we're going to get into the disassembly. It's going to be like the Hyogren video. It's going to be slow and methodical, because I would like to talk about most of the pieces of this gun and how they end up breaking and how you can deal with that. Alright, so jumping into the disassembly section. There's multiple ways in which you can disassemble this gun in terms of order and in terms of which parts you actually want to take off. I would like to I want to speak clearly here so I don't mince my words. It is important that you follow the instructions of someone who's actually showing the gun be taken apart, as we'll do here. I would additionally like to shout out Judge Roy Bean here on YouTube also has a video about these guns, about disassembling it. His disassembly order also works fine, but he also has these same words of caution. Never assume that you can just take pieces off of this gun, or that you can take things apart in whatever order you want, or that you can skip a step. It is entirely possible to get this gun completely locked up, such that it is incredibly difficult to take apart if you take it apart in the wrong order. As an example of this, if you just take the charging handle out of the gun, like if you were to pop the charging handle out of the gun right now and pull it out, getting the gun taken apart at that point is going to be a nightmare. It's going to be very, very, very difficult. That's just an example. There are multiple other ways you can put yourself in a situation where it is hard to get the gun taken apart. Some of these are easy to do, like you might accidentally do it. The accidental ones are a little easier to fix, and if we run into them, we'll address them. Otherwise, I'll just generally describe them. But it is very important that you follow the order of operations here. I will try not to include any unnecessary steps. I hope that you don't end up locking your gun up helplessly, because then it's hard to fix. With that little bit of caution out of the way, we'll set things to the side. We'll set our shell there to the side. First step in disassembly is to pop the magazine down, and then you're going to rotate it counterclockwise to pop it out of the receiver and slide it forward. Looking here at our magazine, we'll take apart the magazine subassembly, if nothing else, to show you guys the repair that I ended up having to do. But the magazine subassembly is your forend, an end cap, and then the tube itself is all this same assembly, and then it has this spring here. This spring is something that, thankfully, you rarely see broken or missing on these guns. Usually whenever you see them damaged, it's just because they've sort of wore out, because it does scrape on the inside of the gun. And if it scrapes down enough, then it won't latch into the gun anymore, and every time you take the mag down, the whole thing will try and pop off. So that is a concern, but that part of it can be welded. If the flat spring part of it, though, loses its heat treat when you're welding it, or it gets broken or damaged or fails for another reason, this is a very difficult part to make. The reason for that, in a nutshell, is that the rails that this magazine rides on in the receiver are cut on a radius. I don't know why they did this. They could have just approximated it with parallel straight lines instead of making them curved, but it rides on curved rails. As a result, this flat spring is also curved. You could make that with a 4th axis machining equipment, because of course it's a flat spring with this knob on it that then has a peg, which is how it's secured. I'm not going to do it because I don't want to risk damaging it, but removing this spring can be done with a punch. You just stick a punch in that hole, and then you can push the spring out. But because it's got that peg on it, just because of the way this piece is, making a new one of those would be very, very difficult because of the radius, because of the peg, and because of the lump on it. All that to say, if you've got one and it's an intact, great, count your blessings. Do whatever you can to avoid damaging this spring, because it's it'd be a nightmare of a part to have to remake. At the very least, I don't know where I'd start. And then at the very end of it, you have to temper it to be a spring, because it has to be springy. It's just no fun. So that is probably one of the best examples, one of the easiest to at least see examples of what I mean when I say these guns were very hand fit. Is like we're filing and grinding parallel curves into a flat spring. It's just, it's ridiculous, right? And those curves aren't functional. They're just there for profile so it can fit in this radiused rail. It's really just something to behold. Anyway, disassembly of the magazine system is accomplished by removing this screw. This is a replacement screw. The reason this is a replacement screw is because the original threads in this end cap were stripped out. We'll see once we get things taken apart here that there have been repairs that other people did, which did not hold up, and now I've got a repair that I made in there that has been holding up well. But our screw is sadly more like a pin here, because the threads were ripped out by past people who were in here doing work. Once you've got that screw out, the magazine end cap can rotate off. Your magazine end cap will probably have a lot more threads, so you'll have to spin it around a lot more times, but once you've got it off, the spring will come out, and then you have a follower you can dump out. Now, if we come here to our magical box of parts, that's what an original follower looks like. And this is what our damaged section of magazine tube looked like. You can see here, here, and here that this magazine tube, which was trying to hold the end cap on, was letting the end cap just like swage its way through the steel going forward. You can additionally see a weld seam there and there, because whoever had this gun before, was working on this gun before, had welded on 2 new magazine tubes, right? You know, there had been a tube welded here, and a tube welded here. This threaded section is obviously like some incredibly soft steel. If like this crummy little screw was able to swage its way through the steel like that, I think you can draw some conclusions about the quality of this repair in the first place, but somebody had already been hacking on this magazine tube. Additionally, right, somebody had already stripped out the threads there at the top. Somebody had also stripped out the threads on the inside here that hold it on to this, and they had tried to fix these threads by filling this up with braze and then running a tap through it. That didn't hold threads very well, and the threads also weren't very straight, so as you were threading this thing on, it was oscillating. It really just, was not a very well done repair. So my deference when repairing guns is to try and save original parts when possible. If the part is damaged and can be fixed somehow, I will try and fix it. However, this gun being a not very original gun at all, there's very little historical value going here, and what I want this gun for is to be able to shoot it and have this be an example of a Walther Toggle Action that people can shoot without having to feel bad about hurting one that's maybe more original or more authentic or more relevant historically. As a result, the fix that I wanted to implement here was not trying to just redo this crappy fine thread that was just going to pull off again. I figured I should fix this in a way that it's going to hold up and be fine. So I took a Auto 5's magazine tube that I had extra, sort of new old stock takeoff magazine tube that had a big dent in it, but the dent section cut off. I just need this front section. Welded it onto our Walther tube here. Then I took an Auto 5's handguard cap, turned it down, then put it into here is a sort of like it's really like a pressed and then welded in helicoil at that point. So now we have those glorious, beefy, square profile Auto 5 threads to hold this end cap on there for good. Now, is this somewhat butchery? Yeah, I can see that argument, but this was already butchered. This was already butchered. They were butchered to the extent that the only way to put them back would involve further butchery, and I've seen how well the original thread pitch holds up. It's not at all. And I wanted to be able to shoot this thing. I didn't want to put this thing back in the non-working, non-good condition these things originally came in. So a little bit of a repair, maybe a little bit of an upgrade in a certain sense, where now the thing is holding up fantastically, put a bunch of rounds through it, and obviously there's no stretching, no failure here. So call me what you will there in the comments, I guess. I would call this fixing a gun. I wouldn't elect, like if this was somebody else's gun, I would never do this unless they told me to, but for me, I wanted a working Walther Toggle Action. My options are, cannibalize this part from another gun and try and go from there, cannibalize this part from another gun and try and go from there, or fix the parts that somebody else has already butchered. So I did feel slightly bad about it, but somebody's already welded on this twice, somebody already welded on this, so I don't feel that bad. And then this follower binds up in the magazine tube slightly, and so as a result, I have an Auto 5 magazine tube. Isn't it weird? You start putting Auto 5 parts, you put Auto 5 parts in a shotgun and it just starts working right? There's probably something to be studied there, but this is the original end cap. Rather than try and grind on it to make it, polish it, right? This is an original part that I don't have to try to save. I can just put it to the side and not use it. I can use an Auto 5 follower instead. It just drops in and works perfectly, which may even lead you to wonder, like they may have more or less just pulled this design from the Auto 5, but there's that. We have our magazine spring. This is the original magazine spring. You can see, this hurts me to say out loud, the spring is discolored here and it's collapsed, and whenever this is assembled, that lines up right where the original weld was. I think they welded on a new magazine tube with the magazine spring inside the tube. Again, somebody butchered this well before I tried to make it better, so that's where we're at with this thing now. So, okay, yeah, maybe I customized it to make it a little stronger, but I think this was the nicest work this gun ever saw, because leaving the spring in there when you weld on it is just it's a head scratcher, and that's really the only explanation I can see. Because if you imagine when the spring is all compressed in there, this coil that's collapsed there, the discolored one that got overheated, is literally right where this original weld was. So that's funny. Anyway, that's our magazine assembly. Really not much else to it besides that. We'll go ahead and set this to the side. Set our wood to the side. I guess one note we can make about the wood is, similar to the Hjulgren, you rarely see these handguards cracked or badly broken. When you do, it's usually, these square notches there were very stupid to include because it's just stress risers to try and cause a crack to start. This really looks like a crack to me. It's so, it's so discolored and it starts right there in that corner, but it's perfectly smooth. I'm not able to make the light make it look like a crack. So perhaps if this was a crack, it might have cracked whenever they first made the handguard and they glued it up then and then finished it, but the finish is original, the checkering is sharp. I think this is how this was meant to be, and that this was either there before it was finished or it's not actually a crack, it just really, really looks like one. I don't know how well the camera will be able to pick it up, but that line going there kind of looks like a crack to me. But it is certainly, it's not something that you can spread. It is solid and rigid, but there's that on the handguard. You rarely see them cracked. I think most of this just has to do with the handguard's not a structural thing. All of the weight, right, the carrying of the weight of this end cap and the shells in the tube and the tube itself are carried out by these rails, and then the weight of it is then suspended by this hanger that just sort of wraps around the barrel and sits there and rubs the finish off your barrel as you shoot it. So that's about what you're looking at there. Go ahead and set this mag tube over to the side. Set our handguard over there. We've got our little screw that just works as a pin to keep the thing from rotating off, and a spring, and a follower. Alright, at this point, we're ready to start getting into the fun. You can just pop the barrels off of these things. However, the barrels are tightened into the upper receiver generally pretty tight. The thing to be aware of, which, again, somebody who worked on this gun before was not aware of, this screw is left-hand thread. This screw is left-hand thread. This screw right there on the front of the receiver by the barrel, it's left-hand thread. Screw is left-hand thread. Barrel is right-hand thread. You will commonly see these screws boogered, broken off, damaged, otherwise messed up, because Walther did the incredible thing of putting a left-hand thread screw on a gun, which is there to keep the barrel, it's there to keep the barrel locked in place, basically. Why did they do this? I don't know. This could have been a right-hand thread screw, right? There's nothing trying to torque that screw. Because for sometimes the reason you want left-hand screws is because there's something that's trying to torque that screw. Like muzzle devices sometimes do this for that reason. There's literally no reason for this to be left-hand thread. Other than like maybe Walther had a sale, they found a sale on left-hand thread taps, and they're like, great, we're just going to put that on the gun. So you'll commonly see these screws boogered or damaged. This screw is certainly boogered and damaged, luckily not broken off, but the screw has very loose fit to the hole that it's in, and it is so boogered that I'm not going to take the barrel off. You don't have to take the barrel off for disassembly. It just makes it so that the upper receiver with no barrel on it is a lot easier to move around, but I'm going to go ahead and leave the barrel on. I just wanted to fully emphasize this screw, left-hand thread. That means that it's not righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. It's the opposite of that because it's left-hand thread. It's a reverse thread screw. The barrel, however, is normal thread. So when you go to take the barrel off, you'd be turning it this way to get it to move this way. So barrel normal thread, screw reverse thread. Please pay attention to that. Don't over-tighten a barrel in there so that it's hard to get out. And don't break that screw off because it'd be a really crappy day to have to deal with a stuck screw in there, because extracting it's probably not going to happen. So you're going to be grinding it flush, taking the barrel off, and then trying to extract it. And you just don't want to do that. So there's my words of condescension there. Pay close attention to that. The next step in disassembly of this gun is going to be taking the stock off. Now, to do this, we are going to need screwdrivers, punches, a bunch of tools. And the thing that I'm trying to get to here is that in a world where the Auto 5 and the Hjulgren are sort of the other competitors, the serious competitors in the automatic shotgun world, It's okay that you need a lot of screws to take apart your gun, because Breda hadn't come along and fixed all of these problems for everybody yet. Remington and Franke also hadn't come along. Well, Remington didn't come along and fix these problems, and then Franke copied the way they fixed them, if that makes sense. But you got screws to take the gun apart. The annoying thing about this is, similar to the Auto 5 and the Hyogren, is the stock has to come off to get the bolt out. I really don't like that, because the stock is wood, and you're having to take screws in and out of wood. Screws and wood do not hold up forever. This screw right here is a good example of that. This is not the original screw for this hole. The original screw for this hole for this gun is gone, because it stripped out, and the screw just fell off the gun at some point. Not while the gun was under my stewardship, certainly, but here is the replacement screw. I'm pretty sure this is a drywall screw that was ground on. It works, right? It does at least bite in there. Now, it didn't really bite in there, and then I filled the hole up with wood glue and then put this in with release agent, which is like it's again a little bit of a hack, but the hole in there was completely bombed out. Like there was no real wood left in there at all, and to the extent that this was biting, I think it was just like sympathetic. So replacement screw there. The ordinary screw I have seen is this, but fine thread. It's very similar dimension screw, right, and countersunk head and all that, but fine thread. Why is there a fine thread screw in wood? It's a Walther moment, I guess. At least it's finer thread than that, because that's about an appropriate thread for a screw into wood. The actual screw these guns came with was finer than that, so it makes sense why you'll very frequently see that screw stripped out and missing. But with that done, we are ready to move on to removal of the butt pad, screw top and bottom like we're very used to seeing. This is an original butt pad that we've got on there. It's obviously deteriorated a little bit. I think it was some sort of horn-based material, right? It deteriorates similar to the Horn Auto 5 butt pad, so that's my best guess. I guess it doesn't make a great deal of difference one way or the other. We can go ahead and get our appropriate screwdriver bit here and pop the stock off of this gun. There's one screw off and the other. Important thing to remember, although I have seen one gun where this wasn't the case, is these are two different size screws. Again, I don't know that all of them are like this. I've seen some that are different size, some that are the same size. I don't know what's original and what's a replacement at that point, but pay attention. Anytime you're taking stock screws off of a shotgun or a rifle or whatever, pay attention for if they're different sizes, because frequently you'll have a lower one, a smaller one lower down in the stock and a bigger one up higher, and if you put the bigger one down below, you can crack the whole toe off the stock, which is unfortunate. We can put these things aside there, because our next step is going to be taking a look up inside the buttstock, where we've got a very funny screw that is not a standard size that's working as a stock bolt. Now, in order to get that stock bolt out, I guess I'll try and give you guys a look at it there. You can see we've got flats right across there. In order to deal with that, you're going to need to make yourself some sort of a screwdriver. This might look like a barrel. I promise it wasn't a barrel with messed up muzzle threads. It's a blim barrel that I milled into a screwdriver. Okay, and then I milled flats on it so you could drive it with a wrench, but I just do it with a pair of pliers because it's even more fitting for our sort of improvised tool here. There is no screwdriver I have ever seen that will drive this stock bolt properly. It's just the way it goes. There are different designs of stock bolts. Like this design of the stock bolt changed throughout the production of the gun, but the driver for them is always about the same. I guess in terms of dimensions, if anybody is very curious, diameter of your driver will be about 750, and then your lugs there will be just under 1/10 of an inch. And this driver works well for taking these stocks off. However, I don't know if I'm going to be able to show it to the camera very well, because I kind of need to hold the gun in my lap to do it, but you can imagine how this works, right? We stick this screwdriver down onto the screw, and then we spin the screwdriver with our pliers to get the screw in and out. So I'll hop off camera real quick so I can get that loosened up, and then be right back once we can pull it out. All right, I got the stock bolt loosened. So now at this point we should be able to show you guys spinning it out the rest of the way. I did want to mention that before we go ahead and get this thing taken off completely, this thing has 2 action springs. It has an action spring for the upper receiver and then an action spring for the bolt. It is possible for the action spring for the bolt to not be retained by the pin that's supposed to be retaining it, and as a result, it is possible for this stock to try and be rocket powered under a spring to try and come off of the gun. It is additionally extremely important, before you take that stock off, you need the striker on the bolt to be cocked. Very important the striker is cocked. So pull the bolt all the way back, press the button to let it come forward, make sure the striker's cocked. Do not try and take the stock off with the bolt locked back. Do not. Bolt forward, striker cocked. Now we can begin taking the stock off completely. Go ahead and get ourselves lined back up with our tool here. And once you've got it spun all the way off, you can then pull your bolt out. Again, you'll see different designs, at least slightly different designs there with the thing, but there's usually some number of washers. I've seen 3 washers, I've seen lock washers, I've seen a variety of things here, but this gun, as it came to me, just had these 2 sort of split washers there on the shaft, and then it's about what you're looking at for your stock bolt. At this point, again, if your action spring for your bolt is not retained properly, your stock could be already have rocketed off, so it's important to have one hand on it as you're taking this bolt out, but mine is properly retained, so the stock will just sort of wiggle off there. As you can see, we have a little bit of a debris from wood glue that we used to repair this thing that's sloughed off under recoil since then, but here is what we're dealing with now, as we now have our stock bolt. Put that to the side, put our wrench to the side. We have our stock. Very common to see these stocks cracked. One common crack is back here. This crack seems to show up whenever people come after this stock bolt with an incorrect screwdriver and then slip off and then punch the screwdriver into the side of the stock. You'll see it more, not more often than not, but you'll see a surprising number of these guns that are cracked, and I think the only good explanation for that, how that happened, is somebody with an incorrect screwdriver went, oops. So again, these stock bolts can be on there very tight. If yours is tight, the only smart thing to do is use an appropriate sized thing that you grind to fit it really well and then spin it off. It is not a good idea to try and take like a screwdriver bit that doesn't fit and try and just spin 1/2 of it. That's stupid. Don't do that. You're going to break something. Your stock, you're going to damage your bolt. This bolt is badly rounded, worn out. I'll probably have to repair that or replace it at some point, and I'm frankly not looking forward to doing that. But there is your stock bolt. We already sort of looked at that. Here's your stock. They explained that crack there. They should have a sling swivel. It's a hard term to say. They should have sling swivels. I don't know that I've ever seen one that didn't have one or didn't have a hole. So it seems like that was a standard thing for these to have. But moving forward on the stock, very, very, very common to see cracks up at the head of the stock. Probably the most common crack to see is the one that starts here at the bottom, extends backwards. I'm lucky enough I've got it on both sides of the thing. I mean, it's the way it goes with these stocks. They crack. Very rare to see one of these stocks that isn't cracked. If you let these cracks progress, they will eventually come all the way back and you'll sort of have the whole top half of the stock trying to come off. Frankly, if you get it that far and it's all the way cracked in half, repairing it wouldn't be too hard because you'd have a bunch of exposed wood that you could deal with at that point. Fixing them before that point is very difficult. Somebody tried gluing this, somebody tried wrapping like a reinforcing band around it. A lot of things have been like this. This stock has stories to tell so far as the damage that it's seen, but multiple repairs. I attempted gluing it. The glue held up one shot. So certainly somebody had already fully impregnated this with wood glue and it was just not going to hold up, because if we look at it from this angle, we can see right where it cracks through there. It's like delicately thin. It's extremely thin, and if you can imagine the action of the shotgun is trying to do this to the stock, it's just trying to crack it where it's thinnest. You'll additionally frequently see cracks here at sort of the top of the wrist of the stock. very frequent to see this crack. I've not seen this crack like split the whole thing in half. Like I've not seen Winchester 1911 shotgun levels of cracks. Eventually this crack will proceed to the point that it gets to the sort of spike, the raise in the comb. I've not seen it crack past that point. It sort of terminates there. That all said, when I got this stock, it was badly cracked. Shooting the gun to try and get it to work mechanically, the stock would get loose and the crack would spread slightly. So I realized I had to do something about the crack. I could either shoot it till it breaks completely and then 3D print a new one, or I could try and do something to save this one that's already been broken and repaired and broken and repaired. Repairs have been attempted all throughout it. Not a very original piece of wood. It's got, as best I can tell, 3 different coats of something on there. And if you compare the finish between these two, this forend is serial number matched to the gun. So that's the original forend for this gun. I have not been able to see a number anywhere on this stock. I think this stock may have come, based on the condition, it almost certainly came from a different gun, because usually the wood ages about as well as one another. So this is already a sort of a wrecked Frankenstein stock. So I made the executive decision to repair it. There is enough meat you can get a brass rod, like a 3/32 brass screw through here, mirror it here on this side, and then balanced between the action tubes for the slide and then the bolt respectively, you can just barely get a 3/32 brass rod through there. Now, with those repairs in place, it's now clamped by a screw here, clamped by a screw here, clamped by a screw here. So now the movement that the stock has at this point is that sort of the, can flex in on itself still, because none of the screws are preventing it from doing that here in this U shape where it's unsupported. But that's taken the movement out of the stock. It's all cinched up, tight, and good now. However, I coated things in release agent here to make sure that my repair was making it so the stock fit on the gun correctly. And as a result of that, you can see that this crack is open, right? This crack is held open slightly for the stock to fit on the gun properly when these screws are anchoring everything where they want to be. What that ultimately means is this crack looks ugly. When the stock is tight on the gun, you can see this crack. This crack is slightly splayed open. It looks terrible, but that crack is not going to move, and the crack hasn't moved since I put these anchors in there. So that's a little bit of a... I won't begin to try and call myself a stock maker, but I have repaired a few. The sort of thing that I've learned is wood changes shape over time as it dries out, as it gets more humid, as it ages, wood contorts. It especially does this whenever, over 100 years, it's got pressure on it, tension on it. As a result, maybe at one point in time this stock fit the gun correctly, but the way that this stock wants to fit the gun now compared to where it was made, when it was made, is different. As a result, this crack wants to be spread open just slightly for the gun stock to fit tight on it. So that's sort of the lesson there, is sometimes you'll run into that. I guess the way to fix this would be completely refinish it, but this has already been refinished multiple times. This checkering is smooth. There's almost no checkering left to it, so this is a bombed out stock. It's at least usable now, and it certainly looks like it has stories that it could tell. But that's what we're dealing with the stocks on these. Not uncommon to see them broken. I'm not going to say that the smart thing to do is to put anchors in them like I have done if you have these cracks, but I can say that if you do put those anchors in, and again that's one anchor here, one anchor here, one anchor across there, such that it sits between those tubes. Measuring that out was certainly exciting, because I was very worried if you drill too high or too low, you've kind of screwed yourself, literally. But no, that went perfectly for me. But these anchors did do a great job of repairing and holding together this bombed out stock. Before those anchors were in there, as you tightened the stock bolt more, the cracks just got wider and wider, and the stock never really got tight. So that's sort of the lesson there, is now you can put the stock on tight and the cracks aren't spreading. There's that. We can put our stock somewhere over here to the side. Avoid banging it into too many tools. We'll leave it over there for now. Oh, at this point, we're done with the dead trees, and we're on to the good stuff instead. No more dead trees. We're dealing with the steel now. The next thing that you can do for disassembly is to pull this spring back and out of this tube. There's multiple designs of this spring that you'll run into. I've seen several guns have round wire springs here. I think that's because somebody replaced the spring with that. I have no way of knowing what was or was not original. Full disclosure, I don't think that these had round wire springs originally, though. I have seen guns that likely didn't have a lot of work done to them, insofar as they were in good condition, square coil wire springs, but you'll still sometimes find some with the round wires. So, thing to be aware of, there's maybe different variation there, and there's certainly variation in the actual design overall of this thing. Disassembling this, right, it's got this half washer thing. You can compress the spring and then get that off. Once that's off, the guts of the thing crap itself off. That's more or less how you would replace the spring if you needed to. We're not going to demonstrate that here because the spring, as you can imagine, right, look at how beefy square coils are. Square coils are strong. Look at how little actual compression you get out of that spring. You better believe that spring is pretty darn tough. The next thing that we can take off here is this tube. This tube is dovetailed in. It will only want to come off one way. However, because people don't always realize this, sometimes they end up getting deformed such that they want to come off the opposite of the intended way. These things are meant to come off from right to left. So if you hold the gun in this orientation, it's meant to just tap out like that, because this little T-slot that it's on is actually cut, so it's like a taper, and it's a taper fit, so it's meant to be tighter as you install it until it comes flush. It's supposed to be dead tight, but over the years, I'm sure people have knocked them off one way or the other, so then sometimes people want to come off this way. Just a thing to be aware of is, yeah, these are meant to be taper and they're only meant to come off one way, but you're not guaranteed to actually always run into that. Next thing that we're dealing with here is the action spring for the bolt group. To get this off, you will need a small diameter punch, and you will punch this out. I mentioned previously that these are not always properly retained. The reason for this is there's a wood plug with a pin through it, much like with the Auto 5. However, whatever wood they used for these seems to deteriorate much more often than Auto 5s do, so don't be surprised if this launches off. Don't be surprised if as soon as you push the pin, it tries to launch off. So cover this with a finger. Ideally, you'd cover it with a rag too. So we'll pretend I know how stiff this spring is, but you might not. So imagine you got like a mountain of old T-shirts or something there to catch it in case your finger fails. You punch that pin out and let the spring decompress. You certainly don't want this rocketing across your workbench and workshop. On this spring, we have a guide. The spring itself, I'm pretty sure this is a replacement spring here on this gun. And then we have our wooden dowel on the end. It's not uncommon to see that wooden dowel completely missing. It's not uncommon to see this pin completely missing. It's a 2mm pin. It sits in like a 2.5, 3mm hole and sits inside of this wooden dowel. You could make a new wooden dowel like this out of plastic, or probably even modify an Auto 5 one with a little bit of time with a grinder if you needed to. But there's that. I'll set that to the side. I have lost this pin for this gun multiple times because it just it blends in nicely with this mat. Not like lost it, couldn't find it, but had to start organizing parts. So I'm going to not lose it this time, and I'm going to put it over there with the butt pad stuff. At this point, you are ready to take out the connector bar. That's the best name that I can come up with for this part. This bar connects the bigger recoil spring, pushes here, and then this pushes with this tooth to engage with the upper. Once we have these parts separated, I will show you. This is one of the stupidest design parts I think I've ever seen. And this is one of the parts that invariably, one gun to the next, they do not want to interchange. Just one of those things that happens. Additionally, this part can get bent through the regular course of firing the gun. And then once it's bent, it starts binding up. I've seen 2 guns where these were bent. This was one of them. Bending it back straight, did a great number on making it so that the gun would cycle reliably. But there's a thing to be watching out for there. You can pull that piece out, and I guess like one easy check you can do while the gun's all assembled like this is this piece, as you're pulling it out, this piece should not have a ton of drag. It shouldn't feel like, it should be, loosey-goosey in there. If it is too tight and your gun's having binding problems, that's where I would start looking. But with that piece taken out of the gun, the next part for disassembly, with all of the spring pressure removed, now we can remove the magazine latch And this barrel retaining bar, it is not uncommon to see guns with these parts missing. Maybe you already mentioned it. Very frequent to see these parts just completely absent from the gun. This bar holds the upper and lower receiver together. So it's really like a key. So if you're familiar with like a key from like engines or something, or gears and drive shafts, this is a very similar thing, only it's linear. This prevents the upper receiver from coming too far forward. It also retains our magazine release here. These are two new manufactured parts I made. This gun has its originals, and in fact, it has its originals and their serial matched, which is kind of cool because it's not very frequent to see that, but here's the originals of those. I went and made new manufacturer ones and wanted to test them out in this thing as a guinea pig. Because these parts are so frequently missing, I wanted to make sure that there's a process in place to make new ones for if anybody ever needs new ones, or I need new ones, or whatever. But my new manufacturer ones have been holding up great, right? There's no real signs of wear or damage on them. They've just been doing awesome there. So we can set those to the side. Frequent to see those missing, though. Now, the next part of our disassembly, we need to pull the bolt back about 3/4 of the way, but if you pull it back too far, you'll run into a problem. In fact, why don't we go ahead and try to rig up that problem. If we pull it back, you got one click, okay, that's fine. Let's say you pulled it back, now we got the second click. Now the bolt is stuck to the rear. The bolt is stuck to the rear by a paddle that's underneath this rectangular section. We'll see more of that paddle when we get the gun taken apart. But when the bolt is stuck in this rearward position, you can't get it to go back forward, right? No, there's no amount of wiggling the receivers relative to each other that's going to get that bolt to go back forward. It's stuck in the back until that paddle gets depressed. That's what this part does. This leg on this part, this angled surface there, comes forward and pushes that paddle, the paddle's vertical, pushes the paddle out of the way. All right, to make this slightly more useful for you guys, we've got the gun bound up like we just did. We're going to show how this piece can interact with that flapper. We'll be able to see the flapper better later, but it's in there. I don't know how well the lighting is going to turn out for you guys, but we're going to take this tool and depress that flapper, which is going to allow the bolt to start to come forward. There we go. That was we'll explain more whenever the gun's disassembled exactly how this is all working, but at this point the bolt is on its way forward, and we can depress the flapper one more time to get the bolt forward all the way. Let's see. The bolt is still hung up on the flapper there, I believe. And just the joy of working on these guns is we're demonstrating why you don't pull the bolt back for 2 clicks. Is that then you have to deal with how the gun is behaving now. There we go. So the receivers are now coming apart. I'm reaching my finger up in there, so once you use this or a chisel or a screwdriver to depress the flapper when it's locked all the way back, you can push forward on the toggle and get it to move forward part way. Once it's moved forward part way, you just need to depress the toggle and then move the receiver, move the lower receiver back, the upper receiver forwards, and then they will come separate. That's taking the gun apart the hard way. We will then, I guess we can go ahead and just mock up here really quick. Taking the gun apart the easy way, and by easy way I mean the correct way. If we get everything lined back up here really quick, just to show you guys, now that we've seen the hard way of doing it, we can compare that to the easy way. Get that lined up there. This is all just general reassembly stuff, but there we go. So this is how we'd had the gun before we started pulling the bolt back, before I showed you guys the wrong way to do it. If you do this the right way, you pull the bolt back. About after that first click, you're then able to push the receiver forward. Sometimes you have to push the bolt back just slightly further, and it'll just come apart like that. That's the correct way to take it apart. It's obviously much simpler than sticking stuff up the butt end of the gun and wiggling them around and trying to get it out. I have seen people suggest that you can leave this part in while trying to wiggle the bolt around. The problem is, though, if you get it all the way back, this part can get bound up in the gun in such a way that now you've got no real way to depress that paddle besides hammering on pieces of the gun to try and get them to work right. And that's dangerous with as fragile as these guns are. So that is my advice. My recommendation of how to take this gun apart was just like that. And if you get the thing locked up by accidentally pulling the bolt too far back, the way to deal with that is, here's our flapper. We can now see them. You reach up with a tool up the butt end of the gun to push this flapper over. And as you're pushing that flapper over, you push forward on this part of the bolt's toggle. Eventually it will move forward just a little bit, and then at that point you're just holding the toggle down and then sliding the receivers apart and off. If you're doing it the wrong way, of course, and if you accidentally get it locked up, that's how you get it apart. And so at this point, we now have our receivers separated. Believe it or not, the upper receiver, where the toggle is located, is the simple part, right? That's the simple half of the gun. So what we're going to do is take a punch. We can see that there is a spring retaining the charging handle. Right there at the very front of the charging handle, you can depress that spring. Be careful doing this because you can accidentally scratch stuff up, but we depress that spring. We can then rotate the charging handle into an upwards position. Partway through that upwards position, it'll have like a key or a tooth that allows it to line up with this disassembly notch right there, and then you can pull the charging handle out of the gun. You can see that this charging handle has been ground on. I don't think those grinder marks are original. Haven't seen them on other guns. So this one has certainly been repaired. The disassembly peg is ordinarily located there. Somebody put a new one on here and welded it in place really good. So that's what you're dealing with. You'll sometimes see like the actual cam on here that interacts with the bolt is this lug right there. You'll sometimes see that lug broken off. You can weld it back on. That's a pretty easy repair, is to add weld material there and then just grind it so that it interacts correctly with the rest of the bolt. But there's your charging handle. Crazy, fragile, stupid part. As cool as that is, there's a reason that the rest of the guns ever don't do that. So there it is. Now to get the bolt out of the gun at this point, we have multiple members of the bolt. The easiest thing to do is pull the rear end of the bolt out, pull it part way back, then tip the bolt, the front of the bolt down, and then the toggle chain comes out like so. You can force it out by doing it another way, but it just comes out nice and easy that way. So that's the way that I prefer to do it. At this point, that's the upper receiver pretty much stripped. You can technically take the spring for retaining the charging handle out. It's traumatic to do so. It's not really meant to come in and out. It's kind of meant to be riveted in. You additionally have a block that's riveted into the top of the receiver right here. That block is meant to interface with a track in the top of the bolt. I think that it's maybe there multi-purpose. Part of it is for aligning the bolt, but then part of it is making it so that the bolt stays square, not just left and right, but also up and down to try and limit the bolt's tilt. Because as we'll see in slow-mo footage of the thing firing, when you go to pull the trigger, the bolt tilts down just slightly, which means that pulling the trigger varies the headspace in the gun. Not much, but just a little, because the bolt itself has just a little bit of free play, right, as a result of being a toggle action. Is it a locked breech? Yes, but how rigid of a locked breech is it? However much slop you have between this rotationally and linearly to this pin, to this joint, to this pin, to this joint, to that hole, to the receiver, by way of this charging handle. So yeah, you've got wiggle room in your lockup on a toggle action, generally speaking. Compared to something like on an AK, you don't really have that wiggle room because you've got helical lugs that you tighten on down on the case. So whenever the case expands back towards the bolt, it's not like the bolt's going to compress, 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 and then tilt as it gets pressurized. And so it's part of the reason that toggle actions are uncommon is because that's stupid. Anyway, there's our upper receiver. We could take the barrel out like we explained, but I'm leaving this barrel in. And you may be able to see I did have to reset this rivet on mine because that block was trying to fall out of the gun. don't know how common that is. I've really only had to deal with that on mine so far, but there's that. And then we can sort of point out lightning cuts. We have a pocket here that's not, I guess that's part of the disassembly rail, but you have a lightning cut in there underneath the spring. It doesn't need to be there. You've got lightning pocket cut here, lightning pocket cut here, lightning pocket cut there. Like, they stuck a bunch of key seat cutters and stuff up inside this receiver to weight reduce it as much as they could, to the point where, like, that wall thickness is under 50 thou. That's a really, really thin receiver wall. So it is kind of cool to see, like, they were chasing weight out of this design. And I'm just going to set this, we're done with this for now. So I can go over here. We don't need to worry about it anymore. And now we're on to our bolt group. This bolt group is all oily because it does like to bind up. And I found that these guns are happy running wet. So we've got our bolt head. We then have our middle member and our rear member. The bolt head has an extractor here. That extractor is held on by a vertical pin. We then have an ejector over here. If the ejector springs on these go bad, the gun can have a variety of problems that aren't immediately obviously related to ejection. It can have feeding problems if the ejector spring is bad. So if you have a phantom issue that you're chasing with these things, replacing this spring can be a good idea. I replaced it with one that is as strong as I could get in there. And as such, it's hard to get out of there, but the way to replace that is to push this forward until it's got like a half moon shape on the top of it that lines up with the slot. You push it forward and then rotate it over. That's how to deal with that. But I've got this one pretty darn tight in there for now. It's actually picked up just a little bit of wiggle, so I might put a shim in there at some point to hopefully improve some feeding reliability. But just one of the additional joys to find out about this gun is your fix wasn't quite good enough. Now, the toggle is meant to be held together permanently. This pin that holds the first joint onto the bolt is meant to be in there for good. You can drive it out. It's just a press fit, right? So you can get it out if you need to. I've had this one apart because if we look here at the top of that middle member, it is what actually cocks the striker. We can see that the striker is here on top of the bolt. The striker, like this pin holding the thing together, is also what compresses the striker spring. And again, I will give credit where it's due. That's a really slick way to do that. All right, now that we're done saying all of the good things about this bolt group, you have two claws or two pegs on this member there, which are responsible for cocking the striker. So to show that to you guys up close, you can see those arms. Very common to see one or even both of these arms broken off. This one on mine, the left one there, was broken off. It's difficult to repair, right? Because you just got a peg floating up there in space. I had just taken some, I think it was 4mm, maybe 5/32 steel rod, drilled a pocket down into the top of the arm, welded that rod in, and then went nuts with a Dremel and files, blacking and checking to get really good, pretty close to perfect, even engagement on those two ears. So now the ears support the striker correctly. The sear is here. You can see that my sear, like many of them on these guns, is colored gold. It's because somebody built this sear surface back up with braze. It's just the way it goes with these guns. This is something that should have been heat treated better than Germany was capable of doing. So they wear out. Once they wear out, you got to add material back. This one was done with braze. I'm going to end up replacing this entire sear. I think is probably just going to be the best way to go about it, so that I can get better engagement, because it's the fit between this foot here on the sear and the trigger group that we'll look at and complain about in a bit. That's to blame for this gun's trigger issues. Almost all of them I've ever dealt with have this trigger issue where you'll pull the trigger and it'll click, but the click is the trigger slipping off of the sear without actually pulling the sear, and you'll get click, 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 oh, and then sometimes bang. So in that regard, they almost even end up becoming unsafe, because you think, oh, what's that clicking? And then the gun goes off as you're trying to figure out the clicking. So Believe it or not, the mousetrap silly gun is also not that safe. Go figure. But the rear part of this toggle link is, again, possible to take apart. It's got like a spring that goes through it in a U shape. You have to lift and then beat that over. It's like essentially like a cotter pin, but just in a U shape. Once that's out of the way, that center pin can come out and get your toggle links apart that way. And then finally, you have this part that I call the Lego hand, because you can see it's like a Lego hand in steel that clips onto this rear piece, and that's what connects your action spring to the bolt group, right? That's how your bolt spring works, is this silly Lego hand. I have seen the Lego hands broken. I have seen the Lego hands installed incorrectly. I've seen them installed upside down. This never needs, there's no reason to take this off the bolt unless something's seriously broken. All right, there's my word of caution on that. Next thing I'd like to call some attention to is this surface right here. This surface is what interacts with the cam surface that I'd pointed to right here on the charging handle. If we put these two pieces together, we can sort of see right there, they're going to mate up. If we show that here up close, might be able to see it a little bit better, but you can see that there are the surface right there on the bolt. The charging handle is going to come and kiss it right there. That's how these pieces get cammed. So whenever you push down on the charging handle, it's going to pull this piece down and then back, and that's what breaks your toggle, like so. And that's why, if you have your toggle, your charging handle here, and you release the bolt, of course, the drive spring here is going to push this assembly forward, and it's going to smash with a substantial amount of mechanical advantage this surface into this surface. Usually it is the charging handle's cam surface that breaks. I was fortunate enough on this gun to have it be the bolt links part that breaks. This was just completely chipped off about right there, all missing. So as a result, the charging handle could not rack the gun. The way that this was fixed, right, the way that I would recommend fixing this because it worked so well, is you get yourself a piece of aluminum. I don't remember, I think this was maybe 8mm piece of aluminum stuck down in this hole, and then you just go nuts with MIG, building up, building up, building up, building up, adding material, and then go nuts with a Dremel tool to grind it to profile. That worked really well. Fix this piece right up, and it's held up great since. But the lesson there, of course, is do not let the gun slam shut on the charging handle. Stow the charging handle in its retained position before you shut the bolt, or else you'll be welding on your bolt or your charging handle before too long. Next piece to look at here on the bolt group is this sort of weird fish hook shape. It's not uncommon to see this additionally brazed on or welded on. This hook shape, as the bolt group sort of breaks downwards, is going to be responsible for interacting with the sort of latch that we've talked about before. We'll show you that more in a moment once we've introduced those parts, but that's sort of what you need to see there on the rear end of this assembly. Another thing to pay attention to is this hump here. This hump is a part of an out-of-battery system that this gun has, and it's also part of the reason that the gun has trigger issues. So pay attention to this hump shape. We'll be talking about it more later. Finally, we have this vertical protrusion. This is responsible for driving the cam plate. We haven't seen the cam plate yet, but we'll talk more about it in a moment. And then finally, we have effectively what acts as a shell stop, so that whenever you have a shell in the magazine, it's this spike that's going to be responsible for sort of holding it in place so that it doesn't get underneath the bolt. But that's sort of what we've got going on for the toggle. That's a lot of pieces that have to fit together, and it's, similarly, I think most people have a decent, let's say, understanding of how tolerance stacks work. I know people want to like look at a single tolerance and say, well, look at the tolerance stacking. I think that this bolt group is actually a really good way to understand the difference in a tolerance versus a tolerance stack. If you think about an 8mm pin fitting in this hole, the size of the hole and the size of the diameter on the pin, that's your tolerance. But now if we think about, okay, here's our 8mm pin. charging handle's diameter here, fits to the bore there, both in straightness and in diameter, affects then the straightness and diameter of the hole here, to the pin here, to the hole here, back to the hole here, to the pin here, to the hole here. If you think about, well, if this is 1 thou out for diameter and 1 thou out for straightness, 1 thou out for diameter, 1 thou out for straightness, 1 thou out for diameter, we're now like a composite 5 thou out, coming all the way back to here, we're then 1 thou out for this hole, 1 thou out for the diameter, 1 thou out for the fit for this to the upper receiver. Like at this point, we're like, what, 8 thou, 9 thou? So 1 thou is a really, really tight tolerance to hold for these things to fit together. But if each of them are held to 1 thou, you've got 9 thou of slop in your headspace. There's a good example of what the problem with a tolerance stack is. Each of these tolerances, if they're all as adverse as possible, can give you a lot of trouble, right? You can be in a lot of trouble if these things don't fit together right. And each of them have to fit together right. Or if this one's 1 thou out one way, this one has to be 1 thou out the other way. So I think that should hopefully help as an explainer for people to understand maybe a little bit better the difference between a tolerance and a tolerance stack, and how each of the tolerances in that line in this toggle interact with one another, and if they interact in the wrong way, you can be in trouble. But for now, we can set that to the side and talk about the even worse part of this gun, that being our receiver group, or lower receiver group with its trigger. Here's our paddle. I know we had just talked about it. I guess before I get the paddle and trigger group taken out of the gun, we can sort of mock up. Here's how the bolt sits. I talked about this driving the cam plate. We'll see more about the cam plate later, but we've got 2 fingers there. The 2 fingers there, this peg just sort of sits between them. So if we mock that up real quick here, we can see, we can immediately see how this little angular feature is going to interact with this latch. It's going to push the latch out of the way as we set the bolt group down into the gun. But we can see how the peg here is going to sit down into the cam plate, and then this is more or less how our bolt is going to ride in the gun, like so. We can see that when this latch isn't pushed out of the way, the bolt group, well, of course, we'd get the bolt group all the way back, which on its own might be a little bit of a science fair. But there's more or less the fully retracted position of the bolt group, and we can see how that fish hook shape, that hook shape on the rear member of the toggle will hold the bolt from going back forward because it's latched, but once that's pushed out of the way, the front of the bolt can then move forward to about this far, and then it still has to be held out of the way for the bolt to come all the way into its locked position. Something like that once the upper receiver has moved forward. It will be something like that for our full locked position. So there is, I guess, a rough, again, without like one of C&R Arsenal or Bruno's animations for C&R Arsenal, it'd be very difficult to fully understand how all these parts fit together. Once you've worked on one enough, having one in front of you, it helps a lot. But I am going to admit defeat to some extent in explaining how all of these parts work together. Once we have them taken apart out of the bottom half of the gun, I'll take another attempt at it, but there's a lot of stuff that's going on all at once. And the thing that I'd like to drive home is the height of the sear, the thing that's driving the cam plate, and the cam plate's responsible for the raising and lowering of the carrier. Like, all of this stuff is affected by the tolerance stack up that starts at the charging handle pin and its fit to the receiver. There are so many things in this gun where improving the fit between parts makes the rest of the gun stop working right, because it relied on that slop to be able to work. It's in this regard that I would like to emphasize that this is not a well-designed gun. It just isn't. Now, at this point, we're ready to take the trigger grip off the gun. This is another one of the situations where paying attention to the order I do things is important. The first thing we need to do is press this button, ideally with the receiver held upside down, because pressing it and giving it a little shake will eventually let the carrier come up. That's what we're trying to entice, is the carrier, the little guy that's there for feeding shells. We want him to pop his nose up. So we might have to stick a tool in there to try and entice it to come up. Now, of course, the reason it's not coming up is we got the cam plate in the way still, derp. So we'll pop the cam plate out. You can get the cam plate out the back just by pulling it backwards. This is a new manufacturer cam plate. This gun just straight up didn't have one, just completely missing. You can see lightning holes. Isn't that funny? Like how much weight was being saved there? Not much. But again, the whole gun is full of lightning holes. There's even lightning cuts made on the links in the toggle that didn't need to be there. Like the pockets didn't need to be as big as they were. And the bolt itself, lightning cut, big old lightning cut in the top. They were chasing weight, man. It's pretty impressive. But here we have our cam plate. This cam plate has two cam surfaces, just two main ones, one on the top, one on the bottom. It also technically uses this as a cam surface, although this is more for its own straightness in the gun. And then the bottom surface is also the straightness in the gun. And then it has a spring to try and bias it down so that it doesn't bind up as it slides back and forth. But it's sliding back and forth on the side of the gun, kicks the carrier up, and then once it's past the carrier, it lets the carrier come down, and then it can slide backwards past the carrier without having to pop the carrier up. So if you sort of look at that, if you imagine the carrier having a peg on it, and things starting here, it can go, the cam plate can come forward, and then this surface here forces the carrier up. But then once the carrier is down, the carrier can follow this track to not come up as the cam plate comes back. So just one more time, we can imagine this is the peg on the carrier. It will come up, and once it comes up, the carrier is up in the air, and then it will decline, and then it'll flop back down, and then once the cam plate comes backwards, the carrier can stay underneath it. That's really all the cam plate's doing, is actuating it's camming the carrier. So there's that. It seems like, you can obviously see there's some places that it's got a little bit of wear on it, but this has been holding up pretty well as a new manufacturer part. Now, with that piece out of the gun, we can now depress the carrier latch there on the bottom, turn it upside down, and we can get the carrier to pop up in the air like this. We want the carrier popped up in the air like this. At the same time that we'll start pulling backwards on the trigger group, and everything will start moving backwards. It'll move about that far. And at this point, we want to make sure that the carrier button is depressed in. The most important thing, right, order of operations wise, is when everything's forward, we press this button, we hold the carrier up. Holding the carrier up will hold this button up. Once we've done that, we can pull backwards on the trigger group. It'll only come backwards part way. At this point, you have to, and I strongly recommend, don't use a serious real hammer. You can see somebody else has attacked this gun with an actual hammer and just dented the crap out of the steel. I don't know why you'd do that. But a rubber hammer is enough. We're going to tap on the trigger group. I've seen some people stick a punch through the back of the trigger group and tap on that instead of tapping on this front face. Frankly, this thing is so weight reduced, there's no good way to be able to tap on it. I would not recommend taking a punch and beating into the steel. The way that it's best to do this is just like this, right? So we'll go after it like this while holding our carrier up. Although once you've got the trigger grip to move back this far, you do not need to hold the carrier all the way up. In fact, see, with our, I guess to show you guys the order of operations, because I have been narrating a little bit too much, we will push this button, allow the carrier to come up, pull the trigger group back, but then at this point we can push the carrier down just part way. And now we have our trigger group back, we have the button still pushed in, and our carrier down. And it's now at this position that we're able to tap with the hammer, and we'll see this little silver steel tab will start coming backwards as we tap. And there we go. That gets the guts of it disconnected. And now my least favorite part of this entire, well, I guess two things there. As you pull the trigger group back, the trigger group being forward is what retains this little latch, the little catcher that grabs onto the toggle. So once the trigger group's coming back, the toggle catcher can come out of there. We'll set that to the side for now. It's at this point that we get to my least favorite part of this whole thing, which is the Tetris game that is getting the guts of the trigger group out of the back of the receiver. I wish that I had tips that I could give you on how to do this, but it really is just a thing where it doesn't have to be forced, right? You do not have to force the parts to do this. But it seems like the best way to do it is to push this arm. So if you push on that finger enough, you can eventually get the bottom half of the assembly, which is the carrier release button. This claw, which is essentially it's the claw that lets the gun know that it's got a shell ready to feed. Talk more about these parts in better detail later, but we can put these sort of back where they belong for now, like so. So there's your mechanism that's responsible for doing the feeding. We'll talk more about that in a moment. With that out, it's still a very tight fit to get the rest of the trigger group out of the gun. It's just like a careful game of wiggling, and it doesn't have to be forced. And it never really makes entirely good sense what specifically you have to do. There it is. I hope that was completely in view of the camera. I held it at this angle and wiggled, and I bet you it won't go back in that same way either, will it? Let's see. Oh, there it is. There's just a magic angle. Something like this. With the carrier up in the air. Alright. There you go. I can't tell you guys how many hours it took me to put this thing back together, get the trigger group out of there the first time, and then put it back in the first time. It was a nightmare. But now that we are here, we can talk about the trigger group. I want to talk about that before we talk about the feeding system. So you've got your trigger here. You've got a trigger nose up here. Pulling the trigger pulls the trigger nose down. And if we look back at our bolt group, right, that trigger nose is just going to pull the sear down. Okay, that makes sense, and that's all well and good. But how does disconnect happen with this system, you might ask? Well, it kind of doesn't. It's kind of a non-disconnected trigger system. So whenever we pull the trigger and we have these things locked together, right, pulling the trigger is going to drop that sear. Once the sear is dropped, bang, the gun is fired. All of these parts are going to move backwards together, complete their cycle, right? The toggle will fold up. The toggle will unfold as it starts coming forward. As it comes forward, of course, you'll still have the trigger in the pulled position. However, the sear is going to smack into the trigger nose. However, to account for this, the trigger nose is sprung, so it can rotate forwards. But the sear smacking into this trigger nose could potentially result in the sear getting pulled before the bolt is fully locked up. This would result in the gun firing out of battery and could cause a great big problem, right? Obviously, you don't want your gun to explode. So the out of battery, in air quote, system this gun has is this hook on the rear end of the toggle. As the bolt is closing, this hook pushes into this hump. What this hump does is just kicks the trigger nose out of the way. Just really quick, it goes thump and kicks it out of the way as the sear is coming into view, right? So, okay, bolts closing. This peg on the rear end of the toggle will hit this hump and just make it go thump, thump. And the time that it spins depressed, kicked forward like that, is the time that the sear takes to get into about this position. At that point, whenever the bolt is fully unfurled, it won't really be pushing this unit. It won't really be pushing into here much anymore. So it just pushes it enough to push it out of the way, sort of like so. Right? It'll this tooth comes and hits it, and it goes clunk clunk. And once it's gone clunk clunk and it's sort of pushed forward out of the way, and then the trigger nose sort of in its pushed forward position, will have to scrape up the sear, and then this is where the trigger reset issue comes from, is the trigger nose has to ride up the sear to get on top of it to be able to pull it again. Frequently that trigger nose will fail to climb all the way up the sear. The sear will be misshapen or misformed, which can encourage this to happen. The sear won't have quite enough of a flat shelf on the top of it, so as the trigger goes to pull it, the trigger nose then just goes back down the sear. This gun's trigger issues really come down to there's not an actual disconnect that puts the trigger nose back to where it belongs. The trigger nose can transit between engaged with the sear and disengaged with the sear by pulling it. It's never in, it doesn't have two distinct states. It doesn't have cocked ready to fire and then a distinct state that can't happen until after it's fired, which is disconnected. It can move between connected and disconnected just by pulling the trigger without actually getting the striker to drop. The same way that the trigger nose can climb up the sear, it can just go back down the sear without ever pulling it. And that's where the trigger issues come from. The best way to correct this is to have optimal angles on the trigger nose and on the sear itself. But these parts were made out of some low carbon junk steel that was case hardened, and the case hardening wasn't very thick and it has since worn off. So these parts wear against each other, and they wear against each other, of course, when things wear against each other, they remove material and get more smooth and more rounded, so that eventually the trigger nose just wants to slip off of the sear. Instead of pulling it down, it just wants to slip off. Once that starts happening, you got your trigger problems. You can weld on the trigger nose, you can weld on the sear, try and reshape it, but frankly, I've had the best success. I've got new trigger noses made, I've got whole new triggers made, and whole new sears made. That's the way to go about it. I just have the gun in more or less original configuration because I wanted to be able to talk to these things. That's the way the gun works. And this way I can't be accused of being biased, right? Because that's the original sear, trigger nose, trigger, bolt, and trigger group from this gun. Those parts all serial match, and it doesn't work. The gun's wore out, right? It doesn't work right. The trigger issue is something endemic to these guns. It's not a result of Frankensteining, because I've seen, believe it or not, there's like defenders of this gun online that are like, well, no, it's actually really good. It's just because people started swapping parts that they started not working. Well, why were they swapping parts on working guns? That doesn't sound right. Additionally, here's one where those parts all match, and it doesn't work. And it just seems to be the way these things are. They need replacement parts if you want to expect, if you get one expecting to shoot it, expect to replace parts and have to put a bunch of time in hand fitting those parts. But there's the trigger mechanism. Show how the feed mechanism interacts with the carrier is attached to the trigger group. It can be removed after you remove the trigger itself and the other pieces going on here, but as I mentioned, I'm not going to do that because I don't like to. We can take this unit here though and slide it together. I believe that's how that's how that should fit together. When the gun's assembled, this silver tab sits in a slot in the front of the trigger group. This finger here gets depressed when a shell gets fed back. Once it gets depressed, that puts spring pressure on the magazine button. That spring pressure on the magazine button unlatches the carrier. Let me try and hold this all in alignment. And it lets the carrier come up. When there's not a shell on the carrier, it can't move. In this way, if we get our cam plate, there's the lug on the carrier that the cam plate drives. The way that this thing locks open on empty is that the cam plate will be trying to lift the carrier, but if the carrier is stuck underneath this finger, right, and everything is latched, the gun will not be able to have the bolt come forward, and our bolt is right here. So the bolt through this peg, connected to the cam plate, like so. Of course, in this condition, the bolt will be all folded up back here, pegs on the cam plate trying to drive the carrier forward, but the carrier cannot come up until a shell is out of the magazine, depressing this claw, letting the carrier come up. So that's how the hold open works in this thing. I call specific attention to that because at the moment on this gun, the hold open works half the time. So half the time that the gun is fired and doesn't have any more rounds in it, the bolt still goes forward anyway. As best I can tell, it's because the spring for this is weak. However, There's the spring for that. A stupid piece of flat spring. And how is it retained? Oh, of course, by sticking it into a slit in this part. How are you expected to replace that? I guess you drive it out with a punch and put a new... Like it's a press-fit flat spring. But it's not like it's press-fit down into a boss. It's press-fit into a slot and a part into a hole. This is advanced stuff you're looking at, guys. This is, I guess, you'll see this. This is probably taken from Revolver design, honestly, because Revolvers do stupid stuff with flat springs too. But this is stupid. This is really dumb. Makes this hard to replace. And as best I can tell, that spring being a little weak is probably where this gun's lack of hold open issues are coming from. But that's sort of what you're dealing with there. So, at this point, I think we have seen how all of the subsystems of the gun work individually with each other. But the thing to remember is that, right back to our question of tolerance stacking, this upper receiver to the lower receiver fits together terribly, right? Because I have to be able to slide, but... Alright, you got a lot of movement there, okay? That's great. That movement there affects this, right? That makes this move. It makes this move. It makes these move relative to each other. Your trigger is here. Your sear is there. I hope you guys can then see that like this gun is a case study in making it so that every single mechanism of the gun that has to interact with another mechanism has like 10 different parts holding them together, and they all have slop. They all wiggle relative to each other. So even if we were to say fix this hold open issue, I bet you that that would induce a feeding issue, because now that this spring is too tight, it doesn't want to feed, and the carrier doesn't want to pop up, and it causes too much drag here because this fits too tight. You know, this fits too tight to the lower receiver, but the lower receiver's fit to the bolt relative is very loose because of these receivers not fitting together very tight. Could you tighten up the receivers? Sure, but then everything else is going to run awry, and that is working on these guns in general. And that's not just ones that have had parts mismatched. That's all of them. All of them fit together in this way, where they are hand fit and they work sometimes only by grace of everything fits together wrong enough that the gun is able to work. I think that's probably the best way I could summarize it. The last thing I would like to call attention to is upper receivers. It's common to see upper receivers with cracks. This one had a crack. It's a very common crack, especially on the early serial number guns. It will crack right through there between the ejection port and the flat here. It's a very thin area, right? It makes sense, especially as weight reduced as these things are. So this one had cracked through there. Someone at some point, based on the patina on the weld, it was a long time ago, welded that up with a great big glob of weld and just left, ground it so it's smooth at least, but they just left it. And frankly, I don't hate that, because that added bit of material probably guarantees that it's not likely to crack there again. I have seen upper receivers crack where the rails holding it onto the lower crack. I don't know that I've ever seen a lower receiver with cracked rails, so it may be a difference of heat treat going on there or something, but it's usually the uppers that you see with the rails cracked. But there are some things to pay attention to there, right? There's some like nightmare fuel for people that buy these things is, yeah, the uppers can and in fact frequently do crack, and just something that you have to be aware of and willing to weld up. I think one other thing, I don't think we'd shown this yet. I called this like one of the stupidest parts ever. If I didn't call it that, it deserves to be called that. Remember, this tube held to the lower with this spring is driving this piece, and that's how it's connected to the upper is a point. A stupid point sits in that hole, and that's how this upper gets driven. I mean, do you think that's going to cause any binding? Nah, I wouldn't worry about it. There's no way this spring pushing on this part, which has a lever arm relative to the upper, there's no way that's going to bind. There's no way that that's going to want to bend, right? There's no way that this really heavy spring and the recoil of the round fired is going to want to bend this, right? My sarcasm is getting the better of me at this point. This is a very frustrating gun, and I'm now letting that frustration out. This was stupid. This gun was not smart. My want to own this gun evaporated so quickly. It happened with the Hyogrin too, but I came back around on the Hyogrin. Maybe it'll happen with the Walther, but I doubt it, because this gun is so stupid. Another repair somebody else did that's holding up pretty well is plumbing solder. I sure don't think that this is good high temperature silver solder. It doesn't look it anyway, because these tubes, the receiver extensions on the lower receivers, will frequently break off. I mean, it's an ugly repair, but you can't really see it, so who cares? I'm not going to fault them too much there. The final thing I'd like to call attention to is this feature right here. I have seen people say that this was just there as like a tooling feature. I don't know if I agree, because I'm not going to be able to show it to the camera because it's like you got to look way up inside of there. But this is not springy back here, but it can be pressed in up here. This little flapper, this finger, can be pushed in there. And on the inside, it has a tooth on it. My best guess is that, I don't know if it's meant to be like a disassembly thing or what, but my best guess is that there's maybe a way that you're intended to, when the gun's assembled, rack the bolt back, then hold this in, and then let this come forward, right? Because if you push it in far enough, I'm not going to force it, but if you pushed it in far enough, like it does eventually grab here on the plunger, the follower on this action spring for the bolt. I don't know if that's meant to be like a super deluxe bolt hold open or something, or it's just meant for disassembly, or maybe it's just meant for assembly, and I don't understand. Like, I'm not capable of knowing how to use it, but it's got a tooth on there, and I think it's meant to grab that part. Not entirely sure what the specifics are behind why that's there, but it is. Maybe if somebody out there, hopefully, but really what this video is, let me level with you guys. This video is a cry for help. I can fix these guns, but I don't understand why. And I'm hoping somebody out there, there's a couple of guys in Germany who have done a great job documenting this stuff. Sour Fan is what he goes by on the internet forums. He hasn't been active for a while. I hope he's still around out there somewhere. This is my cry for help. I need him to help me understand why, because I don't get it. We'll go ahead and get this thing put back together. I will narrate the whole wonderful process of reassembly because it is important, but we'll go ahead, get the thing thrown back together, talk about the tricky things with reassembly, because in my opinion reassembly is even harder than this disassembly, which was already a mess. But now we've seen the thing taken apart, I think we've touched on every individual mechanism, more or less how they work with one another, mocking it up to the point that you've got like your 3-part mechanisms, your 4-part mechanisms, your 5-part mechanisms, your 6-part mechanisms. Oh, just kidding, there's 7 sub-assemblies involved. Getting all of that laid out by hand is very difficult. You compare this to the Auto 5 and it's like the bolt gets caught in the carrier. The carrier's got a dog on it. It just works, and then a shell hits in the shell latch. It's much more complicated to mock that all up here because of the way that all of the parts is. So eventually, hopefully, I'm hoping CN Arsenal will have Bruno do an animation on this gun. Looking forward to that, but I guess in the interim, right, instead of a 3D animation, now that you guys have seen these parts out of the gun, another shout out to Judge Roy Bean on YouTube. I'll leave a link to his channel and his videos in the description, but he's got a 2D animated version of the patent drawings, and I think, like, that didn't make sense to me until I had the gun's parts in front of me, but, especially with regards to this flapper. Once I had all the gun's parts in front of me, though, his animation, like, it makes a lot of sense once you've had the gun in front of you. So hopefully a combination of those will help you guys, until we have a good 3D animation of this gun, understand exactly how all of it works together, because it's a really tight fit. It's very space optimized. There's weight-saving cuts all throughout the gun. You could be excused for thinking, just looking at this, wow, that's so well designed, until you have to take it apart, or put it back together, or expect it to work reliably, because then that's just not going to happen. But that's enough of my complaining. Let's go ahead and get the thing put back together. Alright, so the first step in putting this thing back together will be setting our upper to the side. It's going to be getting our trigger group back in the lower, which is probably going to take a while because it's a little bit difficult to do. So if we remember before, this thing had to come out of here a very specific angle. We'll see if we can find that angle to get it started going back in. And as a reminder, for both going in and coming out, there it is back in. It does not need to be forced. Don't feel the need to force it. Don't try and force it because you can bend or break parts doing so. Now, as we had shown before, the feed mechanism thing here can clip on to the rest of the trigger group. Specifically, this claw arm latches onto the carrier. So what we're going to do is stick the carrier up high here. See if we can't latch this on and then pull it back down. Don't remember if this trick does work, but if it does, that would be great. There we go. Now we have the guts mostly reinserted. As we go to reinstall the trigger group, we have this slot, this channel here for this flapper. For reference, I've never seen one of these springs fall out on their own, but these flappers have a spring on them. If the spring is worn out, that can be one of the reasons that your gun does not have the bolt hang back like it's supposed to, like if the thing just recoils but the bolt never unlocks. Of course, it's this flapper catching there on the rear member of the bolt and then folding it up like so, so the flapper ends up about here. That's what actually, causes the cycle. Because I guess the flapper's oriented like this, but you guys get the idea. We talked about it before. It's the flapper catching on this claw on the rear member of the toggle chain that actually gets your gun to hold the bolt back, pull it open, and then cycle. So, in order to make sure that it is in working order, of course it needs its spring, but it sits down. The round peg section here on the bottom of it sits down into a recess in there. Then you can take one finger and pinch it against the sidewall. I guess as you're putting it in there, you have to put it in there at an angle like this, because it does have this little rectangular peg on there. So install it in this sort of a motion, sort of swoop it in there, and then pinch it against the sidewall of the receiver. And then scoot the trigger group forward, and then the trigger group is actually what retains it there in the receiver. Now, as we are scooting forward, remember we saw the silver plate before, a silver plate here, which is on the bottom of the trigger group. That silver plate is going to need to sit down into the trigger group, and if we look in the bottom of the receiver, right here on the front, we point to it with a screwdriver, there's like a T-slot that the front of that silver plate has to fit into. Getting it to fit in there on the first, on your first attempt here, I guess we'll show it in 2 attempts. As you're pushing the trigger group onto the gun, that silver plate will sit there. You want it to sit flat in the bottom of the receiver, but usually as we go to install things about this far, if we pull up on the carrier, which will involve depressing this hook somewhat, if we get the carrier to flop up and sort of peek there underneath it, it's a really tricky thing to do, but the front of this silver tab has to go into that pocket that I noted, that sort of T-slot. If it is not in there correctly, the gun will not go together and it will not work correctly. And getting it to go into that slot can be very tricky. What I recommend you do is push the trigger group on about this far, and it will usually get this far when it's installed incorrectly. But once it's here, we can push up on the carrier latch button and then get the carrier to flip up. With the carrier flipped up, we can now see the silver plate there is on top of the T-slot. We should not be able to see that much of it. But what you can do here now is pull back on the trigger group. Geez, now this one's being a little stiff. But you'll be able to pull it back just slightly. And now I've gone too far there, but now with the carrier up anyway, we can try and get it in there correctly. This is just one of the joys of dealing with these guns, is getting that sort of feed mechanism to sit flat in the bottom of the gun. It's a real struggle. So now we're back where we started. We can slot it on. There it is, slotted on with the front not in the groove. We tilt the carrier up, we can see it's not in its T-slot there in the front. So now we're going to very gently pull it back just a little, not all the way. We're going to push this back. Now we can see, we look inside of there, you can see just barely the front of that T-slot right there, and then this piece that needs to go in there. So you can take a finger, push down on top of the silver piece, and now push everything forward. And at this point, we have the very front of the silver piece going into the T-slot. Once we're in this configuration, in this situation, we just have to push everything forward all the way to get it to seat. Tap everything home with a hammer. That's now all good. And with the carrier flipped up to inspect, we can now see the difference where this silver piece is now in that T-slot instead of up on top of it. And that's what we want. So that is the trigger group reinstalled. After you get it installed, next thing I recommend you do is your cam plate, just because it's easy to completely forget to put the cam plate in. And in order to do that, you're just going to push down on the spring. It's got its own little slot here on the side of the receiver, much the same way that you took it out by pulling it back. We're just going to put it down, nose first into its track, push down on the spring, and then we can push it forward. You won't be able to push it forward past this point unless you depress the bolt latch. And what I recommend you do is, of course, remember there's the V shape that gets driven, interacts with the bolt here on the cam plate. I like to line the V of the cam plate up with the trigger nose. Makes it easier for reassembly here in a moment. There's that. Giving everything a once over here, just to make sure everything looks okay. Make sure trigger nose moves the way it should. Now, one thing you may want to take note of is the trigger group is going to try and fall. Once that front piece is retained in its T-slot, the trigger group is kind of wiggly. You don't want to start pulling that trigger group back because you can get things to pop out of place, and we really don't want that. So to keep the trigger group from wandering off here, what we can do is take our action tube and throw it back on. With the action tube in place, the trigger group can no longer leave. It's now stuck in place. Of course, doing things out of order here slightly. Sorry about that. Action group, or action tube, we have to leave off for just a moment longer because this piece needs to be installed before the action tube. This actually gives us a good opportunity to see there's that side wedge, and you can see how when it's driven forwards, it pushes the flapper out of the way. So yeah, that's the timing mechanism in this gun, is this flapper that can wiggle in all dimensions. And we really only want it to be able to do this. Well, like we explained, that's the Walther's Automatic Shotgun for you. It's got a lot of pieces that move in ways that they shouldn't. With that reinstalled, we can go ahead and slide our action tube back on here just to keep our trigger group from falling off. And there we are good. At this point, I'll set that to the side momentarily. Get our upper receiver. The bolt group installs the opposite of how we took it out. So the rear end is going to go in first from the front. And just like that, we've got our toggle reinstalled. Take our charging handle, throw it up top, depress the spring here. And our charging handle is now retained, so that's all back in order. And now with our upper receiver assembly back together, and our lower receiver assembly assembled this far, we can rejoint them. Now, to do this, we are again going to want the bolt pulled partway back, because we need to get this peg here on the bottom of the bolt is going to need to line up with the V on the cam plate. And we also need the toggle here to sort of be getting pushed out of the way by the hook in order to get the two halves of the receiver down on top of each other just right. You don't need to worry about getting the post on this sort of weird U-shaped, horribly designed part. You don't need to worry about getting this post lined up with the slot in the upper. We can do that once the two receiver halves are back together. So ignore that for now. Just make sure that you have that piece in there, because if you don't have it in there, you're going to have a little bit of a crummy time getting it in there, because you have to take the action tube back off and all that. So make sure you've got everything set up and that you followed all the steps so far. And now we are ready to put the receivers back together. The first thing is the tail end of the bolt carrier tail, right, that little Lego hand part. Its end has to go into the top hole here for the action tube. That's the first thing that you will line up, is carrier tail into the action tube. Then you'll put the knee, I guess the joint, the lower joint of the bolt group with the toggle will go down into the gap there. And then you'll have a track. The track is about here on the upper, and you're putting it into this interrupted slot in the receiver. And then as you're doing that, we need to get this foot on the bolt to line up with the V like we said on the cam plate. I've got the V on the cam plate lined up so it's sort of aligned with the trigger nose. That way I just have to make sure that this post is lined up with the trigger nose as I set it down. So this is a very tricky thing to convey through a camera, I feel. But if we get these pieces together like that, you can use your thumb to pull the bolt forward or backward to get it lined up with where it needs to be. I think right there it's got it. You can set the receiver halves down together. And at this point, we have our bolt reinstalled, our whole upper reinstalled. You should be able to drag the bolt the rest of the way forward manually, just to make sure everything's okay there. If your bolt is locked to the back, right, if you pull your bolt back too far, you can get it caught on that toggle again. But with the silver piece reinstalled, you just have to push it forward to push on the toggle, and then you can push on the bottom of the bolt knee up the rear end of the gun to get that to move. But at this point, the receivers are back together the way we want, and we can reinstall our block that holds the receivers in alignment. You install that block part way, you install the magazine release, and then the peg there, the block, retains the magazine release. That's how that assembly works. I guess I didn't mention earlier, there's a spring and a blind hole down inside the receiver that acts as the spring for the magazine release. That spring, I mean, you can see that spring is pretty weak, it's pretty flimsy on this gun, but that's fine because all it has to be able to do is push that little latch forwards. At this point, we now have the internal mechanism back the way it's supposed to be, and so we are ready to take the bolt spring and reinstall it, like so, just right up the rear end of the gun. And as before, the spring is under a lot of tension, so we will want to be careful with it. I'll try and hold this in a way I can show the camera. Ordinarily I do this in my lap, but there we go. Get that pin to retain everything. There's our bolt spring. You may be tempted at this point to rack the bolt. Do not do that. Leave that alone. Do not do it. We first have to install our upper spring, and then we have to make sure that the sort of, whatever you want to call this part, this horribly designed U-shaped part, has to be into the slot in the upper that it needs to be in. Now, the best way to do this is to look from the front of the gun with a flashlight. I have no idea if I'm going to be able to show this to the camera or not, but we will give it a try. I have no idea if I doubt the camera's going to be able to pick this up. But with a flashlight, you can shine the light down in there, and you can remember where that slot was in the upper. You can see the hook in the silver piece, and you just have to get them to line up. I'll try taking a picture of it on my phone, and then I'll overlay that on the video if there's any chance that that's going to be useful to you guys. But it's another one of the pieces of the assembly of this gun that's almost done by feel. I mean, you can see it, but only sort of. But I'll see if I can get that picture and then overlay it, and then we'll continue. So with that weird U-shaped thing with its post up inside of the receiver, and you do need to be completely sure that it is in there. It is possible to think that it's in there right, and it's possible even to have it installed in such a way that the gun is capable of firing once before it bends the crap out of this part because it wasn't in the slot correctly. So look through the front. Hopefully the pictures will sort of show you guys, especially if you guys have seen what it looks like, what the post looks like, and what the slot looks like. Looking from the front of the gun with a flashlight, it is pretty easy to see when it is in there and when it is not. But once it's in there, we will just need to hold it there. Remember, because it's depressing this toggle, it's sprung backwards, so it's always going to try and get out of there. But we can pass this spring up the rear end of the gun. And once it's in there, we will take another look just to make absolutely sure that the post is in fact still in the slot. And now once we're here, we will hold the gun vertical to try and keep it from falling off. We will take the stock, reinstall it, and then get the stock bolt cinched up, because the stock bolt is what will finally retain all of these parts relative to each other. So there's the stock coming on. It's on there. Take the stock bolt. See if we can get it to start here. Might have to switch hands on holding the gun with. This is just such an awkward gun to work with. Of course, I'm not even ready for that yet. It's barely even past finger tight. But as soon as you finally feel tension on this bolt, as soon as the stock bolt finally starts getting tight, you don't have to worry about holding the receivers together anymore. Because once there's any tension on that spring, that puts tension on that weird, horribly designed U-shaped part, and once it's got tension on it, it won't be falling out of that slot. Because any tension drives it up further into that slot. There we go. We're getting close. Switch to using this. Trying to prioritize you guys being able to see what I'm working on here. And as such, I can't see what I'm working on. See if I can get it on there. What a fun and exciting gun to work on. Alright, getting the bolt in there now. In fact, that may actually be tension. Yep. The stock is on there. Still accidentally dropped out our cross bolt there. Get that picked up off the floor. Push the receiver back. Of course, it's got to fight spring tension now because we've got the stock bolt partway installed, but pull the upper back against that spring tension. Stick this back in there. Now that spring tension ought to be holding it. Maybe it's just because we don't have the stock bolt fully tight that it wanted to fall out on us. But at this point, we're just running the stock bolt in. Like before, I'll do that off camera so I can avoid damaging this, but you guys sort of remember how that went, right? We use a screwdriver and pliers to get that stock bolt tight. You can get the stock bolt on these things pretty tight, and in fact I kind of recommend you do, because the stock bolts can work themselves loose. And with the stock bolt tightened up, we should no longer be at any risk of this locking block falling out on its own, because of course we've now got a bunch of preload as you tighten up that screw The stock bolt tightens up that spring, which puts pressure on the upper receiver to move forward and holds that tab in place. So with that done, we are ready to put our stock back on with its 3 screws. I guess the 2 screws for the butt plate and then 1 little screw here. Go ahead and put in our little screw first because it really doesn't do much, truth be told. There it goes. I'll switch back to this guy and go ahead and get it installed. And remember, we had our smaller screw on the bottom here. In fact, we can just finger start it. Both of them. Go. Go ahead and get them snug, and then I'll take it in my lap to tighten them down just to make sure we don't scratch anything. And with the butt plate reattached, we are now very close to having this thing back together. Frankly, I think this was the smoothest reassembly has ever gone, although most of the difficulty or ease of reassembly comes down to not forgetting any of the steps and getting all of the steps right in order. But we will take our mag tube and reassemble it next. First thing is the handguard. Get it installed. Next up, we'll take our spring. Probably help if we put the follower in first. Spring, and our end cap and its retaining screw. There we go. Tighten down. Eyeball that retaining pinhole, make sure it lines up. That looks good. Take this screw. Alright, screw's just going to drop right through. And then I'll just clock it over so that the screw's not at risk of falling out. And then last part of reassembly here. Put our handguard on. And we have a reassembled gun. An installation of the handguard into the receiver is the opposite of how it was taking it out. You'll hook the little latch on the spring on and then rotate it clockwise and it'll go in, and then push it up and it clicks. And with that, we have a reassembled Walther Toggle Action. Before we go outside and shoot the thing though, of course, the final step in reassembly is to function check the gun. So we should get 1 click, 2 clicks as we pull the bolt back, it should lock back. Don't dry fire these things without snap caps. The strikers are very weak. You do not want to break a striker, especially with as many shapes as the striker has on it for no good reason. But go ahead, close it up on the snap cap, give it a dry fire. We can also test for reset of the trigger. Get it locked all the way back. And snap cap still nicely in the action. While holding the trigger down, release the trigger slow, pull it again. Hey, seems like we're in business. Now, the other thing that I would like to discuss before we go outside is to talk about the cycle, like the order things happen in with this gun. You'll be able to see it in the slow motion as well, but people call this gun short recoil. I don't want to get too far into it, but I'm not sure that short recoil aptly describes what happens here, because the bolt and barrel will be locked together a short distance. The distance is somewhat less than a shell, but it's a pretty long distance in this gun. It's like 1.5 inches. It's longer than a lot of other short recoil things. But the bolt and barrel will come backwards 1.5 inches, at which point they'll still be locked up, and they will stop. They will bottom out, locked together, still locked, all the way to the back. And then they will start moving forward together again. Once the hook there on the rear member of the bolt gets to the flapper, the bolt will be stopped and the barrel and slide will continue moving forward. They're moving forwards, moving forwards. As they move forwards, the bolt gets pulled back further rearwards, relative to the lower receiver. So to put that in perspective, if my left hand here is the bolt, my right hand here is the barrel, they move backwards together to end of travel. They start moving forwards again, at which point the bolt stops, and then the bolt begins moving backwards again while the barrel is still moving forwards. I don't think this describes a typical short recoil system. It's something else, because they stay locked up the whole time moving backwards. It's not until they stop and then start to move forwards that the barrel keeps moving forwards, and then the bolt moves backwards. And it's not the bolt holding still, but the bolt moving backwards relative to the rest of the moving parts. As a result, you got a different system. Short recoil doesn't describe this. Long recoil doesn't really describe it either, because it doesn't travel the full length of a cartridge, which is sort of like an inferred part of the definition of long recoil. I don't think that's a strict definition, but the bolt doesn't stop. It moves backwards after it has been moving forwards, after bottoming out, while still locked up. So this thing's action is weird. Maybe it's some sort of medium recoil, or it needs its own category there. Once you see the slow motion, I think it'll make sense that it's not like a Luger, right? In a Luger, we're used to seeing the barrel and bolt move backwards, and then the bolt starts unlocking, the barrel stops, and the bolt keeps moving backwards, right? That's regular short recoil, even in a toggle action. This, though, is different. Let's go ahead, run the shooting footage so that you guys can sort of get an idea of what I'm talking about. One final note here before we go and shoot the gun. We're looking behind the bolt down into the receiver. Of course, if your Walther has a dust cover, you'd have to remove the dust cover to see this, but there's the trigger nose pulling down onto that sear. I just want to be able to give you guys an idea of when you have the trigger issue, you can see that the trigger nose is pulling down onto the sear. When it's working correctly, the trigger nose will pull the sear down and dry fire it like that. When you have the click, click, clicking and the gun not working, the tip of the trigger nose there will just sort of pivot forward and run down the sear. We talked about it before, but you guys can sort of visualize it there, where here is what it looks like when it works correctly. When it's not working correctly, that trigger nose will just sort of roll down the front of the sear instead of pulling the sear downwards. Anyway, I wanted you guys to be aware of that, because during the shooting we do run into the trigger issue a couple of times, so that is where the trigger issue comes from. It's the interface between that trigger nose and that sear in this very awkward sort of relationship. So if you guys are running into the issue in your gun, one easy way to troubleshoot it is to peek back in here. Of course, like I'd mentioned, if you got a gun with a dust cover, you will have to pull the dust cover off, then reassemble it, but you can see very easily the relationship between the trigger and sear by peeking inside the gun behind the bolt. Well, we're out here with our Walther Toggle Action shotgun. Gonna go ahead and do a little bit of shooting with it. Now, as to the shotgun itself, as we sort of alluded to about 100 times in the disassembly video and the sort of explanation part of this video, this thing's not a very reliable shotgun. I have had the opportunity to be hands-on with like 6 of these things now, which is a surprising number. None of them have worked 100% correctly. It seems like these guns have so much weirdness going on inside of them that one way or another they're eventually going to have some sort of a problem, and diagnosing that problem and fixing that problem without causing another problem to rear its head is, as it turns out, very, very difficult to do with these things, because there's just so much, complicated gobbledygook going on inside there. During the disassembly video, I sort of alluded to the fact that this gun had bolt binding problems, and once that was fixed, it had trigger problems. I resolved the trigger problems, but then once the trigger problems were resolved, it started having a feeding and ejection problem, and once I fixed that, it then went back to having a trigger problem. So the trigger problem is still present in the gun today. I'll probably end up having to make a new sear for it, in addition to maybe a new trigger nose there along the line. But today, I just want to sort of show off the gun in its original condition. Of course, again, as we talked about in the disassembly section, a lot of the parts of this gun have sort of been brazed on or welded on to add material back and then filed on to try and get them to fit together well enough. So all that to say, don't expect extreme reliability out of this thing, but that to say, don't expect that this is like an unreliable example, because frankly, of the ones I've shot and handled, this is one of the more reliable ones, and it's about 70% reliability, at least as to the trigger. The rest of it at this point, though, is working pretty well. So hopefully we'll be able to do a little bit of shooting, sort of show you guys the experience, what it's actually like to shoot and load and deal with, and then sort of touch on, as they show up, the cycling and reliability issues that these things can have, because boy, they sure do have them. Loading the Walther is one of the cool looking things about the gun, because of course it's got a rotating charging handle. So as you pull it back, it will click once, and that is the cam plate getting underneath the follower, and then it will click a second time whenever the cam plate gets all the way back behind the follower. In this position, you are now ready to drop one shell into the action. You kind of need the shell to be nose in first, sort of sitting like that down in there. Pressing the button throws that into the chamber. Then our magazine release on this side of the gun has to be pulled back and the magazine pulled down. Originally these magazines had springs, as we talked about before. This one doesn't have its spring, and I kind of prefer it without the spring better because that spring will have enough force to pop the magazine all the way off the gun. And as we can demonstrate here, let's say that you had this tube full of shells, 2 shells in there, but you wanted to top off after shooting. Well, if that spring's in there and you don't catch the magazine, you just pop your shell straight out of the bottom of the gun. And if you had multiple shells in there, then you're playing, shell pickup, and that's never ever a fun game to play. So I prefer it without the spring there, but if it has the spring there, you just sort of have to catch it and guide it because it's got that funny mechanism that we showed earlier where this thing's just desperate to fall off of the gun. As cool as the magazine popping down and being able to slide off is, it's not a very reliable system because of how it wants to pop all the way off randomly. But with the magazine down, we can place the shells into the gun for a total of 4 in the magazine, plus our 1 in the chamber. Once the mag is loaded, just sort of squeeze and it will latch back up into place. And at this point, the thing is ready to fire. We'll start here with the gun from the shoulder and do a couple of shots. And of course, down inside the receiver, we sort of showed it during the disassembly section, you can see where the sear catches on the trigger nose. So I can tell right now the next shot should fire correctly, but sometimes that trigger nose, as we talked about, won't get fully on the sear, and that's what causes the dead trigger issue. But this next round should go. And we can keep firing until we get a dead trigger just like that. So there's the dead trigger. It'd be difficult to see in there. Of course, we mocked it up sort of previously for you, but the trigger nose just isn't quite on the sear. And usually slapping the top of the gun with the way that this one's working today, of course, every day it wants to work differently, but slapping the top of the gun will reset it. So we can go here, a few more shots just to make sure. And the bolt's not locking open today. That's a new and exciting issue. Usually the bolt locks back when empty, but again, that's just another one of the things on this gun that there's multiple independent systems responsible for doing each thing, but if one of them is wrong in one way, fixing it could make the other one go wrong in the other way. So just sort of the joy of messing with one of these things. Now, as we go about getting the thing reloaded here, I would like to talk briefly about the recoil impulse. I know, again, we sort of alluded to it earlier, but the recoil impulse on this gun, I mean, it's not a comfortable gun to shoot, don't get me wrong, but some people have made it out to be like, oh, it's one of the least comfortable shotguns to shoot in the world. I don't get where that's coming from. Maybe if you used the wrong sort of shells in it, or you're shooting a gun with very, very worn out springs. Now, the springs in this gun are the most worn out of any of the examples I've handled. And even still, the recoil's not bad. I'd say it's a 7-pound gun, right? If I compare this to what it's like to shoot like a 7-pound 870, this is more smooth, this is more comfortable. So I'm not exactly sure where that sort of complaint is coming from. Now, if you were using loads heavier than these, of course, these are 1200 foot per second, 1-ounce loads, 2 1/2 inch roll crimp, 12 gauge. Maybe if you were using 2 3/4, like the guns don't rely, like the guns will not cycle 2 3/4 inch. So I don't know how you could be, but maybe if you were using some super heavy load in them, it would become less comfortable. But as it stands, it's not that bad of a gun to shoot. So with that said, we can try a little bit of shooting where we start with the gun from the hip and see how frustrating that gets as the trigger refuses to reset here. But go ahead and snap it up. Not bad. A dead trigger there. Give it another try. There we go. Still a dead trigger. Give it a slap there. Sometimes you can just keep pulling the trigger till it goes, but of course the issue with that is you're pulling the trigger, and you're not exactly sure when the gun's gonna go off. So I don't like to have to do that. So we'll keep on pushing through here. Hey, we locked open that time. Isn't that cool? So there you guys go. Of course, we're still facing that trigger issue. It's just the way these guns work. I think of all of them I've handled, there's only ever been one that had no trigger issues whatsoever, that just every time the trigger worked the way it was supposed to. But that's sort of the the nature of the beast, it's the fun. The fun of owning one of these stupid things is they will surprise you in how many different ways they can break and things can go wrong. So, in a nutshell, that's the Walther shotgun. I would like to go ahead and keep on shooting it more, but our repair job there on the end of the magazine tube is coming undone, and so it's probably going to need a new welded section on the mag tube, or just a whole new mag tube made, or something. So, for now, I think that might just sort of be the end of the shooting with the Walther, except that I want to get some slow-mo, and I'm willing to risk our repair job coming completely undone if it means that we can get a little bit of slow-mo. With the trigger reset issue, I don't know how likely that is, but if we get some good slow-mo, then I'll put it here at the end. If we get some bad slow-mo, I'll put it here at the end. And then once that's done rolling, we'll see you guys back inside for final thoughts on what is one of the most frustratingly inconsistent shotguns that I've ever had the displeasure of dealing with. So that's the Walther Automatic Shotgun. If I had to try and sum it up in just a few words, I'd say that it is a very interesting shotgun, like we said at the beginning, but it's not interesting for the right reasons. Of course, it does have those two things, right? The two things that make it so cool, a rotary charging handle, and the fact that the magazine pops down. Those are cool, and I wish the rest of the gun worked as well as, like, as cool as that is, I wish the gun just worked that well, but it doesn't. And I have talked with people, again, who have examples of them that they swear up and down work, but they haven't put a ton of rounds through them. And it seems that by the time you have put a lot of rounds through them, you'll run into one of a number of reliability issues with the guns. Now, I know in the Sjogren video we went into deeper troubleshooting about how to fix the frequent issues that the Sjogren may run into. I'm afraid that there's not as much I can go into here with this shotgun because most of the fitment issues are a case-by-case thing. Like, it's not that this part is always too tight here or too loose here. It's a thing where, like with the trigger issue, the fit between the receivers, the bolt to the upper receiver, the bolt even all the way back to its toggle chain at the charging handle, there's so many things that can matter for each of the way each of the parts of the gun fit together that I'm not comfortable giving advice on fixing, for example, the trigger engagement issue, because if I give blanket advice about, well, you just make it so that the sear is shaped more like this relative to the trigger nose, and the trigger nose, just whenever it's all the way forward, needs to be sort of parallel to the front face of the sear. I don't feel comfortable giving that sort of blanket advice because there's ways that you have to have the parts in the gun to check that. And sum total to get this gun working the way it was took me about 100 hours. and it's still not perfect, right? You saw in the shooting segment that it's still not 100%. It's probably still going to need new parts made and thrown at it, and a whole litany of other stuff just to be able to get it most of the time working. And so that's sort of the takeaway impression of this gun is, as cool as it may be, I think there's probably a reason that there's not more things like this. And when I say more things like this, I'm not just talking about toggle action shotguns, because of course we didn't really talk about it much before, but of course, students of the Auto 5's history will know that Browning's original design for the gun that would become the Auto 5 was a toggle action shotgun. And in fact, it had a toggle action system. Of course, it was a top braking toggle, but the way that it worked with regard to everything coming back together and then bolt and barrel coming forward and then bolt getting hung backwards, kind of similar in that regard to how this system works. And so for that reason, I think it's important to say, I don't think that toggle action shotguns as a whole just a bad idea. It's just that every last bit of the execution that went on here is kind of silly. I think we saw that as we took the thing apart. I mean, taking the thing apart alone sort of clues you into the fact that this wasn't designed very well. But even within, even setting that complexity aside, just looking at the way that the gun works, its reliability plot problems mostly stemming from the fact that nothing in this gun is ever going to fit together correctly because there's so much hand fitting involved in the thing in so many places that loose fit here versus tight fit here changes the way that everything else in the gun works. Like getting one of these, what's normal for one of these things, frankly I think it would be hard to say, but across all of the examples I have firsthand experience with, normal for them is not working very well. And that's just the sort of thing that I would expect out of these guns. That's not to say that you can't get them to a point that they do work pretty well. I mean, there have been days I've taken this thing out and had 50 rounds in a row without a hiccup, which was sort of worthy of celebration, but in this grand scheme of things, I don't want you guys to hear me saying that these things never work, because that's not true. They do work sometimes. However, what I do want an important takeaway to be is that these are not well-designed guns. They are not reliable guns. They're not dependable guns. Maybe the one or two people that have, the opposite of lemons, right? They've got the ones that just work really well. That's great for them. I've handled 6 of these. None of them worked right. Not a single one of them worked correctly all of the time. Now, I'll stop beating on the gun's design and mechanical weirdness here and move on to the perhaps more pertinent aspects of shooting it. The magazine system is so close to being good. If the magazine system wasn't capable of popping all the way off the gun, or even if it didn't have that retention system and it could pop all the way down, but the shells were retained in the mag themselves, that would have been genius, right? That would have been great. Especially because then you could just hot swap magazines. You just pop a mag on, pop a mag off, and deal with things that way. That would have been, A, incredibly cool, but then B, I think a better design than what ended up being put on this gun, because just the ability for the magazine to come all the way down and drop all of its shells out, it's no good, right? That's not a good design. As cool as it may seem, as much promise as there might be in the whole popping down the magazine to top it off and it gets you more of a sealed design, you end up comparing this to, and again, I know that this is sort of comparing something nice to something that's not so nice, but if you're looking at a way to have a sealed up magazine system on a tube-fed shotgun, you look at what the Cosmi did in a similar time frame, at a similar point to when this gun came about, the Cosmi had come about. And the Cosmi just did it in such a fundamentally better way to have a completely sealed up system for shell loading, where this is an option, this is a way to do it, but the execution here was poor. Really what I'm hoping to drive at by saying all this is, it's kind of surprising to me that you didn't see this improved show up really anywhere, because I think it could have been. I think that this system is redeemable. Really the thing that it's missing most is a way to hold, to pop the whole mag off the gun, the mag has to be able to hold on to its own shells. Fix that, and I think that Walther really would have had something here. Now, the ergonomics otherwise, the crank charging handle's cool, it's slow, it's inconvenient, the action on the gun feels like a box of rocks. It's not a smooth, it's not a pleasant, not a nice mechanism on this gun to work with by any means. I guess that, I can't I can't say something nice about the way the gun's mechanism works. The trigger pull isn't good. It's inconsistent to the extent it ever works, which it usually doesn't. The charging handle feels bad. The action feels bad. It's not a very pleasing gun in that regard. That said, the nicest example I have handled did have a smoother action, so this may come down to a thing where as the guns get a little loose, that looseness results in binding, results in the actions feeling worse. I have felt one of these where it was sort of like a one pinky on the charging handle, you could get the bolt back. That was nice, but that seems like the exception rather than the rule. It seems like the rule with these things is they're kind of crummy feeling. The overall balance and layout of the thing, besides that though, it's really not bad. No real complaints there. It balances well. Frankly, I'll come out and say it. I think this balances better than a standard weight Auto 5. I think the Light 12 Auto 5s balance better than this in turn, but comparing a sort of early 1920s standard grade Auto 5 directly to this does balance better. The standard stock dimensions for this are better than you would have got on an Auto 5 at that point in time. The forend here is miserable in comparison. This is a much less comfortable forend. But the forend is probably the least important part of a shotgun's fit. So in the grand scheme of things, I'd say that, all else being equal, compared to what you could have gotten in Auto 5, this is a lighter weight, better balanced, more ergonomic to someone who's 6 foot tall or more shotgun compared to what you would have gotten in Auto 5 then. That is praise of sorts. Of course, we talked about before, the length of the stock, the fit of the stock, wasn't because they were trying to make it fit 6 foot tall people. It was because they were worried about people getting bit by the action. And of course, that is a legitimate criticism with this gun, is again, there's nothing to tell you, keep back behind this point. And as a result, I've seen people, right, get their thumbs bit and mashed and chewed on. If you choke up high enough, right, you can get the web of your hand in there and get the whole web of your hand, smeared by the rear end of this slide. It really is not a forgiving gun at all in that regard. And I don't know if I want to chalk that up to being a design flaw necessarily, because in a fantastical world where the Auto 5 stopped having caught on and this caught on, maybe this would be normal, but this isn't normal. And as a result, in the reality we live in, right, where there were 5,000 of these things and they don't really broadcast the fact that they're going to try and jump back and bite you, it is a little bit of a problem. Now, on that same note, we talked about it briefly during the shooting segment itself, but I do want to reiterate on it here. I have heard from multiple people say that the recoil on these is grueling or something, or that it's miserable. A lot of the people saying this seem to have not shot one themselves, and they're relying on someone else who shot one. I've now shot several of these things. I would say that this is the most clapped out, hardest recoiling of all of them that I've shot, and it's not that bad. It's not as bad as a 7-pound break action or a 7-pound inertia gun or anything like that. The mechanism here doesn't have that friction brake system that we're used to from the Auto 5, so I don't want you to hear me saying this thing is a smooth shooter, because it's not. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not as bad. Right? The recoil springs are doing something to sort of slow down that recoil impulse that you're feeling, and by the time you do get that recoil impulse shifted into your body, you've already started to move backwards because that force is transferred through the springs. So it is more comfortable to shoot than an equivalently weighted 7-pound pump action or brake action or inertia gun, right? Anything that doesn't have that sort of softening, cushioning effect. Right? This has something. It's not a lot, but it's something in those springs, cushioning the recoil before it reaches you. Compared to something that doesn't have that, this is a smoother shooter. Not that this is a smooth shooter. I would put this sort of at the bottom of the recoil-operated shotguns I am familiar with, that I have experience with, which at this point is close to all of them. This is not by any means a silky smooth pleasant gun to shoot, but I've heard people make this thing out to be like, oh, it's a recoil monster, it's unbearable, it'll leave you bruised. It's a bunch of baloney. It's like I don't know if this is coming from people shooting ones that are somehow even more clapped out than this one. Have a hard time believing that's the case. I don't know if people were shooting loads that were way too hot for these things through them. That is entirely possible, but then that lesson would still hold true. Like, putting loads that are way too hot through a 7-pound pump action, it'll beat you up similarly, right? It's not like there's a unique amount of getting beaten up that happens with this thing, but certainly if you were running heavier loads, this is going to be more uncomfortable. It's a 7-pound shotgun. That's how 7-pound shotguns work, especially if they don't have some sort of like very positive recoil reduction system. And by that I mean like the Browning friction brake system or Beretta's kickoff system is frankly very effective, right? It's effective in a different way than the Browning friction brake system, but trying to compare apples to oranges, even still, those are very good recoil reduction systems that do smooth out recoil a lot. This doesn't have that, but it has something, and something is more than nothing. So comparing this to a 7-pound pump action, running the same loads, this is going to be smoother, and that's just the way that is. So I do want to make sure that I push back on people, because I've seen multiple people, including people who haven't shot it, assert that the recoil on these is just grueling. And when I try and like press them on that, like, why do you say so? Well, they say, well, so-and-so said so, right? Ian said so, or this person said so, or someone else said so. And then you go and try and see, and like, well, they shot like 5 rounds through it or something, and it's not clear what rounds they were shooting. And so at that point I start to get skeptical of, is that real? Like, what's the basis for comparison? What's going on here? So I feel like I can speak from a perspective of having a pretty good basis of comparison, but with having shot pretty close to all of the other recoil-operated shotguns, and I can say it's not a bad shooter. Doesn't beat you up like some people have said that it does. Now, final thoughts and considerations on this thing. Do I like it as much as I did whenever I wanted it? No, not even close. Would I say that you shouldn't want one? I believe I said this about the Hyogren, right? I believe I said about the Hyogren that if you think you want one because it will be fun to shoot, you should not get one. I'm not going to change my position on the Hyogren, but I am going to say that if you wanted either this or a Hyogren and you planned on shooting it, get the Hyogren. Don't even think about getting one of these things, because fixing the Hyogrens is easier, diagnosing problems with the Hyogrens is easier. You can disassemble the Hyogren without it being a whole like Tetris puzzle box disaster. And in the grand scheme of things, if you have to make a new part for a Hyogren, they're dimensional and they're interchangeable to some extent, right? There's a couple of caveats and little yablets there in the Hyogren, and we talked about that in the Hyogren's video, that there are some parts in that gun that are fit. I don't think there's a part in this gun that isn't fit to this gun, and if you try and swap in parts from other gun, I don't think that you're ever going to be able to get away from the need to fit parts to individual Walther automatics. And so as a result, if you're buying one because they're cool, okay, great, I agree. Really cool shotgun, right? It's maybe even close to being pinnacle Eurojank, right? Well, look, the Europeans tried making a shotgun and it really wasn't good. Fantastic, right? But if you're buying one of these things thinking, well, I'm going to go and shoot it, or I'm going to do this with that, or I'm going to actually use it, right? If you're planning on using it for clays or birds or whatever else, I will caution you that you're going to pay a lot of money for them because they cost way too much, and then you're going to put a bunch of money into fixing it, and it's still not going to work. And that's just the way that these things seem to go. If you're one of the lucky few that has one that just works, right, you just bought it and it just works, that's awesome. You're the outlier, you're the success story. It doesn't usually go that way with these things, and I want that to be the word of caution, right? As cool as these things seem, especially in video games and whatnot, they're abysmal to have to actually deal with, and I want that to be at the forefront of your mind whenever you think about these things. Is they're one of the worst automatic shotguns ever manufactured and sold. It's barely beyond a prototype, and frankly, there are prototype shotguns that are more reliable and more robust and better built than this thing. And so, as a result, the conclusion, the takeaway for you guys is, definitely don't want one of these. If you do want one of these, I hope you don't want to shoot it. And if you do want to shoot it, I guess you're going to need parts, and you're going to need somebody to put the parts in your gun, and it's going to be a little bit of a mess. Maybe to drive that point home just one final time. After making the Hyogren video, I had multiple people reach out, needing parts for their gun, and I had found that, geez, at this point, I probably made 5 or 6 different pieces in the gun, and of those, I've sold multiple variants to people who are needing those parts. Only in like 1 or 2 instances have I had a person come back and say, I had to do a little bit of fitting just to make it fit my gun. In every other instance, I fit it to that Hyogren that I showed off in the video, they put it in their gun and it just works, right? And it chugs and it does great. I don't think that's ever going to be the case with these, except for maybe small parts like the safety drum, where the only thing it interacts with is the trigger group and the trigger, so there's no sort of tolerant stack-up nonsense going on there. for pretty much any of the parts of this gun that actually break. Maybe actually with a perhaps important exception of the receiver lock there and magazine release. Those can switch between guns pretty easily. So there is the one thing, is like, if your gun's missing those, great. I've got more of those made up and I can make more of those. It's not hard to do. So there's the one silver lining. The one part that is missing from these guns most often because it falls off because the gun's not designed well, it is possible to make new ones of those easily, and those should just swap one gun to the next because they don't fit very tight. And again, it's not a tolerance stack problem, it's just how does it fit into the lower receiver, and that's about it. But otherwise, these guns are a mess, and I want you guys to remember that these guns are a mess. And with that, I think we're ready to wrap up here and send you guys on your way. If you enjoyed this video, or like videos like this, or like videos that aren't like this, because we do some of those as well, I've got a Patreon. It's between the video and the comment section where you type out, well, I've got one of these that I've put 5 rounds through and it's never jammed in 5 rounds. So the description is there between those two. In the description you have a link to the Patreon. Support on the Patreon helps me make more videos like these, where it gives me the time and willpower and resources to sit down and learn as much as I can about these weird shotguns, and then show you how to take them apart, and then make new parts for them for those of you who have these that need new parts. So of course, any support is always greatly appreciated, but just leaving a comment or a like on the video is plenty of support as well, or subscribing. I promise you, if you subscribe, you will see more shotguns, and believe it or not, we probably will have 1 or 2 that are worse than this, which, oh boy, I'm just so excited for. But this is probably close to the low point in terms of shotguns that are no good. Hopefully from here we'll at least have a little bit of an upswing. There's a couple that I've got planned / partially edited. They're coming soon that are really, really cool, and they're good shotguns. They range from the good kind of interesting to like actually legitimately very good guns. So a couple of those in the tubes coming here soon. I hope you guys have enjoyed this deep look at Walther's only automatic shotgun for good reason, and I will see you next time.